There we go. We might run next week in person, and then I'll make a call from there as to which ones we'll do for the rest of the term. But usually I like to do week 7 right after Flex Week, and G you all up, and if some people turn up in week 7, then we'll do one for the exam as well. But to be honest with you, a lot of teaching, I think, particularly lecturing, is done pretty well online, just because I do this little rant every year, but it's like this screen is downscaled, if you can't tell, to like about maybe like 25 to 30% of a normal like monitor. So there's like a lot less, like harder to show you code in person, for instance. They finally fixed some things at the uni, so this mic actually goes through to the live stream now, which is kind of wild. That's like a new thing, which I'm pretty excited about. There's apparently a camera up the back there, which points. I'll show you this just because I feel bad that we're late, so I might as well waste more of your time. But you can, Anyway, I figured it out before. You can like make that camera move. You look up at everyone at home right now is bored to hell, but you can make it like, some of you can't see it. But next week, next time we're here, I'm going to point it at the crowd randomly, and we can have a little spy on some people over on this side. If you can see it pointing at you now, so we'll have fun. Okay, if you didn't catch it already, my name's Hayden. You're already set up in the course. You already know what this website is, or you've been on the forum. Otherwise, I don't really know how. I guess maybe you just looked at the timetable. Who's not got access to the course website or knows anything and has not received an email from me and just turned up at 6 p.m. today? Because it's on your timetable. Great. OK, well, you're all pretty comfortable then. We're going to jump straight into the first little lecture today. Oh, no. That's OK. I know where that one's hiding. So where is it? We've got goodness. Goodness gracious. That's OK. The what one? In the overview. Oh. OK, I'll fix that up later. We're going to talk about this course website that's a janky piece of crap later. But for now, we can have a little bit of fun with this. Let's look at the pretty version together. So no doubt, 623, you've all got a really strong confidence in me. We're going to do our best to make that a little bit better. Today's lecture is pretty light. I like to run the first lecture of the course very light, very fun, just talk a lot about the course, what we're doing. We just spend about an hour discussing the term, how it's structured, what assessments are coming up, and then for the rest of the week, you're going to actually be learning some things. So I'm sorry in advance for those who come here tonight, pumped to learn everything about HTML. That's not what we're going to be doing here tonight. We're just going to be talking a little bit more high level. So why 6080? I'm going to pick someone at random. Who's my nice friend in the red up the front? Hello. Hi. What's your name? Yes. Harold? Aaron? What? Avron. Why did you study? Why are you here for 6080? You don't have to be. It's an elective, right? Want to learn some front-end things. Good. Who else wants to learn some front-end things? Yeah? Half of you? Don't know what the other half are doing, which is good. Who's here because you ran out of other electives and this is the least bad one you could find? That's positive. Yeah, you ran out of least... Yeah, good. OK. So The why is a really interesting question. I talk to students all the time about like, why are you studying this course? You get people saying things like, oh, I want to go and be a front-end developer. I'm really interested in front-end. I want to code it for personal projects. There are lots and lots of reasons, right? Most common ones are that it's helpful for industry or that I want to do some other stuff in assignments, you know, particularly in other courses. Because there are a few other CSE courses where they ask you to build front-ends. And a lot of what you'll learn in your degree is kind of, you know, in the world of web, a lot of what you're learning is much closer to server-side programming, you'd say. It's much closer, you know, the Python, like think of 1531, 2511, 2521. All this stuff is typically things you see appear much more on the server side of things. Most code written these days is JavaScript, and you know, this is an older stat now, but it's no doubt probably gotten even worse. You know, in 2018, 1 in 4 job postings were for people using JavaScript to build front ends. It's extremely common. You're seeing more and more apps that are front end heavy than they were in the past already. So it's just massive. It's like literally like this course is touching on, in an industrial sense, the most relevant part of your world right now. You know, maybe that's going to change. So there's a huge industrial relevance to what we're doing here. And a little bit of text here. Within 10 weeks, I want to make you all confident with building your own web apps, and I want you to build them quickly, and I want you to try and build them correctly so they don't break, right? As bug-free as possible. That's what we're really here to do. So you finish the course, and you go, yep, I can build something. I can visualize it in my head, and then bring it to reality. And there's a whole bunch of you here that are doing things like CSE SOC, or maybe you're doing some part-time work, maybe a side project, and I'm hope that we can kind of enrich your skills so that you don't feel inhibited. Because who knows that feeling where like you want to build something, you want to make an interface, but you just like can't, right? So we're here to punch that in the face. 2 important questions to answer. What is a front-end developer, and why is this so relevant? Why is that 2018 stat so big? The whole 1 in 4 people need JavaScript front-end. So a front-end developer is someone who writes code that is executed client-side. That means that it's essentially people who write code that runs in Google Chrome or Safari or Firefox or Microsoft Edge or Internet Explorer, whatever. People use that still. So it's just run in a whole different place. You're not going to be writing really on command line. It's not running on servers. And most of it is done in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Has everyone heard of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? You've probably heard of it, seen it around. Who's ever seen HTML? If I said to you, "What have you seen HTML before?" Put your hand up. Yeah, right. It's kind of floating about. You kind of see these things around. JavaScript you might hear about. CSS you might hear about. And they're really just the 3 languages we're going to be talking about in this course. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So in summary, what a front-end developer is, what we want you to be at the end of the course, is someone who can take HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and make pretty pages with it that run in the web browser. That's 10 weeks of your life. Most excitingly, I think, you build things for people to use. So there's a few of you in here who probably are much more oriented towards who here has a favorite course of Comp 2521? Someone must have enjoyed it. I don't believe you all. No, okay, yeah, one, yeah, we got tribute. Good. You know, Comp 2521 is like some students' favorite course because they just love like bubble sort. You know, they just like really love it. They like it. Bubble sort has hurt some of you. It's fun. It's interesting. It challenges the mind. It's all kind of tucked away. It's not very human, right? Like when you were learning about quicksort, were you inspired by the problems you were going to solve for everyday people? Like you weren't, right? So we're kind of on the other end of this spectrum that's attracting a different type of student, a different type of energy, which is people who like to just have people use their stuff. You know, like very tactile, very human, very product. Any of you are interested in product design, product management, software, you know, like Canva is one of your kind of cliched examples these days as like a big tech startup that's like building things for people to use. That's where we kind of are aligned in terms of our interests. Now, we talked about web exploding. I want to give you a quick history of web. I've been programming generally since I did my undergrad degree in computer science, but I started web development before that because I thought it was interesting. So I haven't been around since the beginning of web, but I've probably seen the last like 15 years of web now, which has been pretty wild. And it's really cool. Like honestly, as having seen it all go through, it's like the fastest developing, you know, part of tech. Like you look at languages like Python, it's like wow, like Python has a few extra operators, or PHP still somehow gets upgraded every year, even though I don't know who still uses it. And then like Java's got some extra, every language kind of has some extra features over time. But what's happened with web is like chalk and cheese over just the last decade alone. So, but if we go way back, web is obviously much later in life than computers. Computers came about, people built networks, and then eventually you had the whole World Wide Web, internet thing, and then people said, how are we going to interact over this? Someone said, let's make a way to share documents over this like global network of computers. And that's where HTML kind of came from. HTML was a language that was designed to simply make documents that you could share around. So you think about PDFs, right? PDFs are just a standard type of document that lets you display some kind of flat content. HTML was kind of that just for pages that had some pretty basic needs. It was like, we want to display text. We would like to be able to put images there. We want to be able to have certain text take you to another page, so you could kind of get this interlinking effect. And want to be able to have nice things like headers and dot points and so forth. Now, in the pre-recording lectures this week, you'll see a lot about me talking about Wikipedia, where it kind of reminds me of that classic web. Let's go to Deutsch today, might as well. Well, that's intimidating. Does anyone know what random article is in German? I'm going to guess it's that one. I'm not going to guess that. So as you can see here, we have a thing in the world. But this is like I like this page. Again, I'm sorry for the repeat. You'll see this in the pre-records. But this reminds me so much of like that really old school web that's before most of our times, right? Unless we have someone here who's like 40 or so in age. But it's simple, right? It's tables, it's text, it's dot points, it's headers, it's images, and it's links. That was what HTML was designed for, to create stuff like this. And to be honest with you, the majority of this, there's a few things you couldn't do with just HTML, but you could make a page like this 25 years ago, right? The inception of the web. From there, people thought, that's really ugly. Pages like Wikipedia are cute, but they lack a bit of life and a bit of style. So the second language we're looking at in the course, CSS, kind of started to float into existence shortly after, just a few years later. And that was where we could have color and spacing, and everything became just dynamic and alive. Most websites you see now will look much more like this than they look like this, right? CSS is purely styling. HTML is structure. This is where web started to get cool. Some of you might kind of remember these. Remember these websites? Like, and all of you aren't like that much younger than me. It's like, do you remember being a kid and just like websites were much more boring when you were super young? You couldn't do all these crazy things with them. It's like that. That's kind of where most of you probably come into the world of web. Now I'm just going to click across the YouTube comments because the volume is at max, but I don't know why there's no. I'll go mix this. I'll go mix this after the lecture and re-upload it. But I don't. Anyway, I don't know why it's already at max. This is at max. For anyone listening at home, I hope you're listening hard. And can you see? So someone's complaining they can't hear in their right ear. See how there's like 2 green bars there, and one of them's not very green? Yeah. Yeah, that's a shame, isn't it? Anyway, I'll go mix this at home and re-upload it. So anyone who watches this later on won't have this problem, or if you watch it later, you won't have this problem. But to people online right now, I'm terribly sorry, Sandy. Sorry, everyone. This is why I get a bit iffy about in-person lectures when no one turns up. So we have our basic CSS and JavaScript. Now, also reference JavaScript here. JavaScript was a way to make web pages more dynamic. Every time, like when you load a web page, it just kind of looks like a web page. Until you click something and maybe a pop-up comes up, or maybe, like think about Facebook, you're on there and you click on a picture and the picture kind of goes full screen all of a sudden with all these comments and you click like. JavaScript is the engine that's running all those little micro interactions. Previous versions of JavaScript weren't very complicated. They could only really do things like hide an element, show an element, maybe give you a little alert or a notification or a little pop-up asking for a box. So early web was very, very simple. And that's kind of how the web existed for a while. For your sake, probably from like, most websites in the early 2000s were pretty simple from when you were probably very young. Then, really importantly, we had the introduction of Ajax. And there's a few lectures we do on this in week 4 or 5. I think week 4 is Ajax. Ajax was where the people who developed JavaScript and web browsers came together and said, how about we develop a system where JavaScript can quietly in the background communicate with servers and exchange information. And this was probably one of the most transformational parts of the web that still is why it's like massive today, because that's where you started to get apps that could kind of quietly collect data in the background. The earliest memories I have of that were like Facebook Messenger, or like emails that just like you don't have to refresh the page. It was essentially the beginning of you don't have to refresh the page anymore. Stuff just kind of happens dynamically, you know? So you go back to like email accounts from the early 2000s, and like when you sent an email, if you wanted to see if someone replied, you had to hit F5, you had to refresh the page. Then you don't anymore because JavaScript would be pulling information in the background and dynamically updating it. Now that's the basis of everything now. Literally, like you think TikTok, Instagram, all that information is just getting sucked in and sent out constantly without you needing to like reload the page. So this is where we started to see websites be used for what started to feel like apps. Because before this point, you know, you'd have your kind of native applications on a computer, and then you'd have your websites. And the websites were all crap, but the apps could do lots of cool things. This is like around this 2010-2012 period. Web was starting to get pretty powerful now. It could kind of mimic apps in some ways. Like you look at Microsoft Teams or Slack or Discord, once Ajax was kind of introduced, you could basically build those applications 10, 15 years ago without a problem, right? That was pretty transformational. What happened soon after was that industry and the open source community really started to ratchet up. So two big technologies that were introduced were Node.js, which we touch on lightly in this course, and TypeScript, which we don't touch on in this course. Node.js was the running of JavaScript on servers. So previously, JavaScript only ever ran in the web browser. It was a language for Google Chrome to run things on. But people said, hey, we can actually run this like we run Java and Python. We can run it server-side on the command line to power the systems that feed information to the web browser. That was massive, and I think that was, I can't remember who championed that one. I'm not too sure off the top of my head. And then we had TypeScript, which was people's reaction to, like, you had this kind of 2010, all these like new companies like Facebook were using languages like PHP and Python and JavaScript to start actually running their systems, which was super new, because if you go back, way back, people were using like Java and C++ and these really like heavy industrial type-safe languages, you know, with like ints and doubles. Kind of hard to program with, but they were very like reliable. So you had this wave of people writing these websites in these hacky scripting languages like JavaScript, but then they started to break, essentially. So these, if you who's ever written Python compared to C, it's much harder to debug stuff or notice a bug, right? You like write code and there's just like problems, whereas C, the compiler will like hunt you down, you know, and like find you if you make a mistake. So TypeScript was a typed version of JavaScript that was essentially front-run by industry to say, you know what, we really like JavaScript and what it can do. Can we make a version of it with like ints and doubles and chars, basically? These two things industrialized the web technologies in a way that nothing really had. So suddenly you had companies like Microsoft, Facebook, Google saying, you know what, this language is powerful enough and we have the infrastructure to build these systems at scale. So the popularity of that completely boomed. And then what continued this like skyrocketing movement of web technologies was hybrid apps, things like Electron, where people said, hey, you know what would be really cool? If we took Google Chrome, right, we got rid of all this stupid header bar at the top up here, and we just ran a single website inside that box. So imagine that you release an app on the App Store, or like the Microsoft Store, or what's the Apple Store? The App Store. Okay, sorry. The App Store, and it just looks like this window box here, and you call it like the Comp 6080 slide deck app. And that's all it was. So and it's really interesting because there's a lot of apps you use, and I referenced them before, like Microsoft Teams, Slack, and Discord are the three easy ones to point out because most of you, who hasn't used any of Teams, Discord, or Slack before? Couple people, right? Most of you have. All of those things, even when you install them on your computer and you have them as an app down here, they're all still just web browsers in disguise. They're running in the background. They're often running a technology called Electron, which is where it's kind of like, think of it like, it's like another Google Chrome app, except all the headers are gone, so you don't realize it's Google Chrome. It just feels like a normal app. And this was really exciting for companies because they could build things like Slack, Discord, Teams. They could have one code base that's just a website, but then package it up not just for the website, but for Windows computers, Mac computers, you know, Play Store, App Store. So suddenly the appeal of building front ends with JavaScript and these technologies, as opposed to like the old school ways with Java and C++, was like obvious because you could just code it once and deploy it everywhere.
Of course.
And then on the tail end of the industry interest in front end, you had declarative frameworks picking up. Some of you have probably heard of this, and I'm sure a bunch of you are doing this course because you want to learn React, or someone told you about React and you want to be cool or something. But you got like Angular was like the first one, React.js, Vue.js. These things made JavaScript less awful to play with. You'll kind of experience that in this course because one of the assignments we get you to do is essentially a old school JavaScript assignment where we help you understand the underlying science of how JavaScript works. And then later on, we do an assignment that's focused on these new modern frameworks. And essentially, these modern frameworks meant that if you're a JavaScript programmer, your life was like 4 or 5 times easier than what you used to do. So super, super powerful frameworks. And all of these things really just stacked up to make the technology we're going to cover in the course basically the most obvious way to build 99% of everything. So if you're building a consumer application, something for people to take and look at and interact with on a computer, there's an extremely high chance it's all just going to be done with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in some derivative form. So that's why this stuff's so exciting. That's why web's exploding. That's why we care about what we're doing in this course. Any questions about that? I will check the chat. OK, it looks like the right ear is just muted on OBS, is it? Can you mute a channel? How do you unmute a channel? Sad. Advanced audio properties. Oh, let's make it mono. Let's try that. Test. OK. Hello, right ear. All right. I'll still mix it later. I'm so sorry for the people at home. I was talking to someone on the way here. I know I keep mentioning it, but I'm so conflicted because these in-person lectures are so much fun. Who's having fun? Yeah, right. But it kind of sucks at home. But I'll keep doing my best to make sure it works. Andrew says mono woohoo, sound booster plugin, deaf in right ear, so I'm fine. Press the red volume button. Oh, this is the MacBook mic here. That's not a that's anyway. None of you care about that. Let's get back to it. So now we're going to talk about the course, right? This is where it's admin stuff now. Now admin stuff is kind of boring, but it's one of those things. If I tell you everything, you know exactly what's happening this term, and we're all good. We assume in this course that you have a basic understanding of Git, HTTP, web servers, and scripting languages. Anyone here who's an undergrad already has that. Anyone here who's a postgrad might not have that. But if you lack any of that assumed knowledge, or maybe you did it a while ago and you don't feel comfortable with it, we have a whole bunch of material that helps you out with that. So we're looking after you in that regard, and we'll talk about more of that soon. The learning outcomes in this course, obviously we said HTML, JavaScript, CSS, but in a nutshell, we want you to be able to write, test, and debug code. We want you to understand those core languages and the technologies they run in, so HTML, CSS, JavaScript in the web browser. We want you to understand the modern frameworks that are used, those React, Vue.js that I mentioned earlier. We want you to understand asynchronous programming. This will be new for a whole bunch of people because there's a good chance at this point in your degree you've probably only programmed with like some mix of C, Python, C++, Java. JavaScript would be the first time that you have a language that has blocking I/O operations that decide to run in a separate, I don't want to say thread because that's technically wrong, but kind of run concurrently on the side, which changes the way you have to program. It's really cool though. It's like one of the coolest parts of the language, but That will be a bit new. Basic knowledge of front-end security. I won't lie, we don't do a lot of that in this course. I should probably get rid of that. That's why we have a websec course you can go study. And an awareness of UI, UX, and accessibility design. 90% of this course is it's a code, but there is a little bit that's like, how do we make our page like pretty and fun, you know? All of that. How do we make it accessible for people who maybe have vision impairment or hearing impairment? Sorry. So I just think, yeah, anyway. Our approach to teaching this course is that it's a challenging course. I'll give you my little 30-second ramble on this. This will feel different to some other things you do. This is a breadth topic. Front-end is really different to like what you do with something like 2521 or C or algorithms and data structures, where you just completely focus in really hard on a problem. I was talking to a student about this sometime in the last week, but the trouble I think that students have in this course that causes them stress is that you can see if you screwed up, right? Like you're making a front end. You know what it needs to look like. So it's really obvious to you if your work isn't good enough. And I think in a normal course where you get like, say, an algorithmic problem or something, you can think you got it right, but you didn't. And you find that out later, right? You submit an assignment, you think that's 100, and then you get it back and it's like an 82, and you're like, oh, I guess I screwed up somewhere. This is tricky because you'll kind of know that the whole time, right? Like when we're like, go make a blue button that appears when you click the red button, you're gonna know if you didn't do the blue button because you can see, you know what I mean? So this is just like my friendly comment to you all. You need to go in realizing that you're gonna have a natural inclination to wanna make everything perfect and finish everything, and you're gonna feel like if you can't do that, that you're too dumb or things are too hard. But often it's not the case. Often it's just that you can actually see clearly everything you need to do, and that will haunt you. So look after yourselves is the point. It is still a challenging course. Sometimes it'll feel like things are hard or long, but that's okay. Remember, only like 10% of you are going to get HDs, right? Put your hand up if you want an HD. Problem, right? Big problem. That's not to say we cap that. If you all do well, we all give you HDs, right? Like, we're not monsters, but yeah, there's more hands than people who will perform at that level is the point. So don't put too much pressure on yourself. You know, I've had a lot of pass terms. Who's never had a pass before? Like a pass, like as in always higher than a pass. Yeah, you're all shy. I'm sure you're not all that silly. I'm sure there's some brainiacs in here. So yeah, that was just my comment on front end and our approach to teaching. The course website that you've seen so far, I built this website using everything that we teach in this course. So I was like, cool, let's just like spend a weekend, we'll build this little site, you can kind of see it and play around with it. The purpose of I'll really quickly explain this. The purpose of building this site was that one of the funny things about front end is because everything's so broad and all these topics are interconnected, it's really hard to just be like we're going to learn A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because quite often things fork out kind of like a tree and then they interrelate. So for example, let's say you want to go watch a lecture on CSS rules. We wanted to be able to more easily say down here that this is the lecture you need to watch first, and then these are the lectures you can watch after it. And then at the bottom be like, these are some tutorial questions that you can do if you want to learn more about this specific topic, right? So that was the gist of it. So it's really geared towards 60/80, right? It's a 60/80 course website. Hopefully that's fun. You know, everything's kind of pretty clearly hooked up. The videos are there, the slides are there. A lot of lectures have code. Some lectures don't have code, for instance. So everything you'll find is on the course website. If you'd like to look at the source code for the course website, I put it up on GitHub publicly. So, you know, no one does this because you all have better things to do. But the theory was like, if you actually care, there's nothing stopping you from actually going and cloning it and, like, in theory, running it. Except no one's ever done that. So there's probably going to be a bug when you run it because no one's ever tried, probably. But if you want to, you can. The point of it was to say, hey, if you think this course website is cool, and like I think it's cool, I don't think it's like the coolest thing in the world, but it's like a little cool. I'm like, oh, that's nice. You can build this at the end of the course. Literally, everything here is just what we've done in the course. So that was the purpose, to get you a little bit excited. One thing I added that I'll probably reference later is that there's a lot of little lectures in this term. And obviously, if you're a student and I give you one 2-hour lecture a week, you think, oh, that's OK. If I give you like 8 little lectures, you think, 8? That's a lot more than 1. And then it got tricky because we started adding more lectures. Like, for instance, we have a lecture on CSS fonts, where we teach you a little bit about fonts on the web browser. But you don't really need to watch that lecture. Like, if you don't watch it, you're probably going to be OK. And we didn't want to like hide it from you. We didn't want to give it to you and make you watch it. So we have these little buttons up the top here where you can kind of choose your own adventure. So if you really don't, if you're just like, tell me what I need to know, doc. I got things to do. I just need to pass and get on with my life. This is like the filtered list of lectures here. That's like the bare minimum. And if you're like, I want to learn everything, then there's like lots of stuff. And we've tagged everything. So basically, mandatory is like obviously it's not mandatory. You can just watch none of them if you want to. But it's like, I'm telling you, you should watch it. That's my recommendation to you as a person. Recommended is like, it's probably helpful, but you'll be OK. Like, you'll be OK. You know, you're not going to be like, oh, golly, I didn't watch the JavaScript advanced functions lecture. And then we have extension, which is basically like, if you don't watch this, your life probably won't change in the context of 6080. But it is, it's really interesting. So most of you aren't going to watch the extension stuff. The majority of you are going to watch the mandatory and recommended stuff. You'll probably get to week 5 and stop watching the recommended stuff, because you'll be like, OK, I'm pretty done now. We talked about why it was built. We just wanted to show you, it's all built-in things we learned. So that's super fun. I don't think I updated this slide for this term, so I'm going to skip over that one. Oh, there is no team. Yeah, I think I removed the names because I kept forgetting to update it. We have a bunch of great tutors. One cool thing about this term is that, did you know there are 700 students studying 6080 this term? I think that makes us like the second or biggest elective now, which is wild, right? So congrats for joining the waitlist. And who here was like on the waitlist 2 weeks ago? Like a month ago. Yeah, so CSE were like, the waitlist is full. We need a waitlist for the waitlist. So they made it bigger, and now many of you are here. So this course is super massive, and that's really exciting because we've got a big teaching team. I think we've got like 30 tutors or something wild. I think we have the most help sessions for a level 6 course in CSE. Whole bunch of cool stuff. There are a few lectures from a couple of people from Canva in particular, and a couple of guest lectures from Canva too. So you'll see those throughout the pre-records. Now, in terms of the assessment structure of the course, really simple. You have 4 assignments. They were 15, 5, 30, and 30%. So medium, tiny, big, big is how they work. The medium one's due at the end of, well, start of week 3 in 2 weeks. The tiny one's due at the start of week 4. It's really, really simple. And then you have 2 major ones due at the start of week 7 and the start of week 10. And then we have a 20% exam. And the exam is essentially it's like a mini assessment under time pressure. I usually tell people that I think it is not very fair to put people in closed book exam conditions under time pressure, generally. I think most people agree with that. The reason they do it is to avoid cheating. But you know, you're always going to have access to the internet, right? I can't imagine a time in your professional career that you're going to be needing to code front end, and then the office is like, the internet's down, but we still got to hit the 5 p.m. deadline. And you're like, don't worry, I got this, right? That's not a scenario that you're going to have to deal with. So exam's open book, right? But what I do think is interesting is giving you something small and asking you to complete it within a few hours. Because realistically, to be honest with you, in the real world, sometimes you need to work a little fast. But also in the exam, we don't do things like mark how nice your code is or anything like that. It's kind of like a little speed run event. I make it sound like you got to be like, you know, Sonic the Hedgehog or something, but it's not like that crazy. But the point is, it's a light, short, hacky, build this in a few hours, see how far you get exam. And that's that last 20%. Start your assignment early. Assignment 2 and 3 are optionally done in pairs. It used to just be assignment 3. I'm trialing out doing assignment 2 and 3 with all of you this term. I assume you're all going to stay in your pair unless your pair is like a serial killer or something. Like, I'll get 1 or 2 emails that's like, help me, you know, get me out of this. That will happen. I'm going to quickly look at questions. Drago says, does anyone else only have the course outline and timetable show up on the course site? If you have that problem, that's just because you haven't logged in. There's a login button in the top right. You can go and log in. If you aren't logged in, it's just like the public version. We don't kind of have the content available to everyone. We're getting close to a quick break. We're not going to run till 8 tonight, so don't stress. OK, a few technical notes about the course. Assignment due. OK, so UNSW kind of instigated this policy where you have to do a 5-day period at the end of an assignment where like there's like a late penalty, and it's like 5% per day. So in theory, we're meant to pick a due date, and then we have to give you 5 whole days to submit it late, and like a really light penalty. So let's imagine that, for instance, we wanted something to be due on a Friday night because we needed to start marking on a Tuesday, right? Because we need to give you like that Saturday, Sunday, Monday to submit it late with the penalty. What we've done in this course, and I'm still waiting to find out if I'm going to get in trouble for it, but it's all in your favor, so listen to me, is that rather than like pick a date and then pick 5 days, I've just picked the end of that 5 days as the due date with no late penalty, but that's the end of the submissions, right? So like, there's no late submissions in this course. That's not because I'm a dickhead and I'm like, no late submissions. It's because it's like we're making the due date at the end of the period we typically accept late submissions from. Now, obviously, there's like a reasonable grace period. If you submit a 3-week assessment 20 minutes late, no one's going to be like, you disadvantaged other people, right? We're not monsters. Don't email me being like, oh, it's 3 hours late. It's like, no, that's just you being dumb at this point, you know? Like, pending like an extenuating circumstance, like your house was on fire or something like that. But there's hard deadlines for the due dates. There's the students every term who say, I don't want to do any of the old school JavaScript. I want to do the new school JavaScript. That's why I'm here. That's cool. You can go and study some TAFE course online. There's so much stuff about new JavaScript out there. And it's so interesting because one of the reasons this course was made, honestly, was because there were people in industry who were hiring people who went and did like General Assembly front-end courses. They would hire them into companies like Canva and Atlassian, and then they would be like, wow, they can really build a front-end, but they don't really understand the science of how a lot of this works. They don't have that kind of underlying knowledge that's really critical for this. So, oh, I'm hotspotting this. Oh, it's all right. No wonder it's bad. Figure that out. I'll do that. I'll fix that at the break. Oh. Data's expensive. So they kind of came back and said, we want to find a way where people can you actually help create a course that we could share with people where they can actually go and learn those fundamentals. So that's why we teach those fundamentals. We're always reviewing lectures. This term I went and re-recorded a whole bunch of lectures. Typically we go re-record about 20% of them every term. So please like and dislike the lecture videos or comment on them on YouTube. Literally just like give your feedback there. We can't teach everything. People always want to learn something like TypeScript or Redux, or there's a few nerds in here who know this stuff and they want to do more of it. We only have so much time and we don't want to crush you. And there's no labs in the course. It's a level 6 course. We give you all of the tutorial questions up front with all of the solutions and all of the worked video solutions. So you have everything you need today. You're all adults. You can work through it. You don't need us to like hide the solutions for you to force you to do the work and then give them to you at the last minute. You should be able to demonstrate some discipline there. Now, let's take a 5-minute break. I'm going to play around with some settings. We'll keep going at about 7:05. So go stretch your legs or do whatever you need to do. Hello?
Hello. Hi. Hi.
OK. Feels so quiet. So we'll keep going. See, even now I'm bored, you know. Who's hungry? I'm sorry. We'll get through it. Let's get through it. We'll get through it quick. So some summaries of how the actual teaching interactions work. Every week, we have 2 hours of live lecture and 2 hours of pre-recorded, roughly, right, on average across the term. So tonight we do 2 hours. We do not have a lecture on Wednesday, all right? Don't turn up on Wednesday anywhere. Don't look for a live stream link. But you have lectures to watch online. So if you come here, you'll see that, like this week, we have tonight's lecture, but then we have these other lectures to watch. That's it. Now, the pre-recorded lectures each week come after the live lecture. So the idea is, you watch this tonight, you go do the pre-records in your own time before next Monday, then you watch week 2's pre-records after next Monday, etc. We do that because if we do all pre-records, then you'll get a little bit lonely, right? A little bit sad. And pre-records kind of suck. They have their weaknesses. You can't really convey often very term-specific things. Did you know every term students have a different mood? Did you know that? Sometimes they're really depressed. Sometimes they're really tired. Sometimes they're really angry. There's a general pattern. So I don't know what you're all going to be to me yet. Hopefully you can be the happy ones. But we will see. When it comes to tutorials, you can ignore that first dot point because we just changed that last minute. But all the this whole thing is this whole section's a bit of a doozy. But ignore the whole online comment. Basically what we did a year ago was that we ran a whole bunch of online tutorials and we recorded all of them. And then we snipped them up and we uploaded them to YouTube so you can watch the solutions. Why that's good is because that means that when you go to your tutorial, it doesn't matter whether your tutor covers this CSS DevTools manipulate question. You can just go and watch it on YouTube. You can go and watch a 16-minute video where Emily Luxor talks about stuff and goes through the solution, right? So the benefit of that is that you should go to tutorials not to learn things feeling like you won't learn them, but because you have fun, right? If you don't want to go to a tutorial to have fun and interact with people, I just suggest you watch the pre-recorded videos. They're all up there, But we have lots of tutes. A lot of them are in person. If you have an in-person tute, I'd encourage you to go. It's like the first massive in-person tutes we've been running for a while. And also, if you are enrolled online, just go to an in-person tute anyway, because tons of people aren't going to turn up because they don't want to turn up, right? So if you're in an online tute, just feel free to go to another tute or go to a different online tute. We don't really care. Go to whatever class you want to go to. If I'm not getting my point across very well. I mentioned we have a whole bunch of help sessions. Help sessions contain different amounts of tutors each time, so please be wary of that. We do our absolute best to timetable these according to our expectation on student demand. Right, so these are all the different help sessions in different weeks.
Kind of like this.
If there aren't many tutors there, it's because we don't expect many of you to have questions at that time. If a ton of people turn up, we got that wrong, and no amount of screaming at your tutor is going to magically make tutors apparate out of thin air and help you, So in those cases, you'll have to go to the forum, or you'll just have to go to the next help session, but that's pretty rare. Usually things are pretty well balanced. But tutors are amazing in help sessions, so go have fun with them. In terms of the assignments, someone pointed out before the break, there's actually a typo here. Assignment 2 and 3 are done in pairs. It's meant to be assignment 3 and 4. We shifted the names around last term, and I haven't quite nailed out every instance of it. So it's the last 2 assignments. Now, in terms of those assignments, the first one is static HTML and CSS. So the first one that you can do as of this week, HTML, CSS. The second one's a little bit of old school JavaScript. The third one's a lot of old school JavaScript. And the fourth one's the React.js modern framework. And the last 2 are in pairs, obviously. Now, if you need help throughout the term, first place to go is the forum. If you can't get help on the forum, then you go to help sessions. If help sessions aren't very useful, or your question's a bit more personal or boutique, please email me at cs6080. Making sure the stream's working. I'm paranoid now. Right ear. OK, yeah, that's a positive right ear. So that's how you get help. When you get set up in the course, one of my favorite things about 6080 is that there's no setup required, because you know what? Your compiler's like the web browser, basically. And most of you have a web browser installed. So at least when you get started in the course, you have everything you need. For week 1 and 2, you don't really need to install anything. You can just work on your computer. Generally, most of you won't work on VLab or the CSE machines, and that's like totally normal and fine. You just work on your own computer. Most of what we do in this course is run on GitLab. Again, I'm aware postgrads, you might not have had as much experience with GitLab, whereas for our undergrads, you will have dealt with GitLab, and there's a high chance you would have been putting up with me for that. So I'm sorry. That's where all of our assignments and content are. Undergrads, I don't need to explain any of that to you. Postgrads, most of you figure it out. If you're not sure, you can go to help sessions. We specifically instruct tutors, if you have a postgrad coming and asking questions about Git or GitLab, feeling nervous, love them deeply and look after them. That's what we tell them. So, you know, don't feel scared. Like, the course staff are literally there to help you if you have any trouble with that. There's a few extra sections on the Eccles website for resources. Honestly, I don't think there's much here you have to read. Mostly it's here because students share like something with me. They're like, oh my God, there's this website I really like. And I'm like, oh, it's true. I want to do something with that website you really like. So we put it here so that it doesn't just like disappear into a black hole. In one of the CSS Flexbox lectures, you'll actually see one of the resources here is this cute little game. You'll see this in the pre-records where you have to make the frog get on the lily pad by writing the right code. You know, so there's a few fun little things like that you'll see around. That's what that section is for. This course, we don't have any style guide besides some automatic style checkers later in the course. But that doesn't stop a lot of people asking, can I have a style guide? Because, you know, you might feel new to front-end programming. You feel like, sure, just because Hayden says we don't have a style guide, I still want to have something to learn from, like a good template, you know, like a good mentor or something like that. So you will also find those on the resources page. Floating about, particularly for Java, where is it? React.js. Yeah, Airbnb style guide. There's generally not really a style guide for a lot of the earlier parts of the course because either languages are so simple or people don't use them a ton these days. But for the latter part of the course, we use Airbnb style guide. That's a creepy emoji. Throughout the term, you can leave anonymous feedback by clicking on the feedback button at the bottom. So if you'd like feedback, if you have feedback or things you want to share, post it there. Don't post anonymously. You can post anonymously, but I'll be really, and this is the same even for my experience. Like in my experience, I don't know if they stop you, but like feel free to tell me who you are, because sometimes people say things like the course is too hard, and I'm like, bruh, I don't know what to do with that information without a follow-up question, you know? So if you have feedback, it's really good sometimes if you can tell me who you are, because then I can talk to you about it and I can learn more specifics. These slides always feel so pointless because this is like obvious, right? I hope. Be nice to each other. I say it now and again. You don't know who's on the verge of complete mental breakdown at any point in time, right? So don't be rude. Don't be rude to your tutors. They're not meant to be rude to you. Be nice, be caring. You know, you're going to deal with some stuff this term. I'm sure most of the people that are at risk of you not treating them nicely are not people in this room this term. But regardless, if you do interact with people in this room, try your best to be a good person.
I can just do that.
Now, the last thing before we wrap up is to essentially talk about assignment 1 briefly and to touch on just realized my MacBook is charging, but the PowerPoint's off. Okay. That's messed up. We're going to do a really quick demo, not of anything fancy, but we're just going to have a look at assignment 1, and then we're going to show you how to get set up and how to start writing it. It's going to take maybe like 5 to 10 minutes max. So on the course website, you can come here and go to assignments, and you can click on this assignment 1 has been released. Now, this link won't work for me because I'm not a student, so I have to kind of go to it the boring way, which you don't have to worry about. But the assignment's called Pick to Code.
Assignment's already out.
I can't do anything about that, just before any of you be rude. And this assignment is basically, this is your first assignment, assignment 1. It's due in 2 weeks. I don't know what time on Monday, but 2 weeks from today. And what we do is there are 3 questions, and those 3 questions give you an image, like a flat PNG, JPEG, and then we say we want you to write HTML and CSS to generate a page that looks exactly like this. That's all the assignment is. Now, this assignment aims to allow students to demonstrate knowledge they've developed during weeks 1 to 3. The vast majority of this assignment you can do with the pre-records over the next, this week. So the next 5 lectures that you watch on the Eccles site, you can do assignment 1. That's the purpose of assignment 1. It's to get you in, to get you working, and to get you submitting very quickly. Right? It's not meant to be earth-shatteringly difficult. Some of you will find some of it hard, but it's one of those things, if you just start early, then you're fine. If you go watch a few lectures tomorrow, you can start it, and then by the end of this weekend, you should have it half done easily. So don't wait, because it won't wait for you. Now, the 3 questions, the first one here is this page here, this image right there. See that? That's an image. It doesn't look like it because it's mostly text. We want you to make a web page that looks like that. It's really simple. The first question is super easy. It's it's a bunch of text, some dot points. Most of this is just HTML, literally, barely any CSS. And then there's a couple of there's a box there and a yellow thing there. That's the kind of thing that would, if you knew what you were doing, you could do that in 10 minutes. Might take you an hour or 2 as you're kind of getting comfortable with it. And like a lot of things in front end, you'll find that getting half of it done is pretty quick. You'll get the text on the page, and you'll be I'm mostly there, but then all the little tweaks and spacing will really be what messes you up. Here's a good example. You see this image here. See how this yellow thing kind of extends further left than the rest of the text? That's going to take you a minute to figure out what to do with that. There's a lot of questions people always ask that's I don't know how to do that specific thing. A lot of this assignment is going to be experimenting and tweaking. That's how even experienced web developers make pages look a certain way. They don't look at this and be I know exactly how that's going to work. They start and they iterate and then they iterate, and then there's a weird thing they're not sure how to do, so they try stuff, that doesn't work, try something else. And again, I work with people who've been doing this for a dozen years. They still do the exact same thing. So don't feel like you're dumb or you haven't been educated right. It's just part of the process. So that's the first question. The second question, and also we give you all the text and stuff. We don't expect you to write out the text from the image. We did that one term and I got attacked. So we fixed that up pretty quick. The second one is a little Tetris game. This one's meant to be on the opposite end. Rather than a whole bunch of text, it's a bunch of squares, really. There's no text on this. You're now starting to play with a little bit of color, a little bit of layout. You're creating a grid. Hint, 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 grid. There's a lecture on grid.
That's very funny. They made Tetris.
That might help you. So that's that, right? Again, that one's fairly simple. I haven't probably done something like that, but that's probably something that would take maybe 30 to 60 minutes for someone who knows what they're doing. I haven't done a bunch of stuff like that. That might take me an hour or 2 to play with. And that's literally, I don't do a lot of CSS these days. So, that'd be a lot of I don't know what to do here. I'll just figure some stuff out. The good thing about this question that I like is if you don't know what you're doing, there are some really ugly, horrible ways to do it. For instance, just being you know what? That really looks like a table with 30 rows and 10 columns. And they're all just different colors, and some of them are the same. And copy, paste, That's 600 little blocks now. So that one's fun because I like it. It doesn't inhibit you. There's if you spend the time, you can maybe do it smartly and quickly. And if you just want to give up, you can do it poorly and slowly. And even then, it's probably not going to be that slow. But you won't want to do that for a reason we'll get to in a sec. The third question is probably where most of you will spend more than half your time, I'd guess, particularly if you exclude the learning curve aspect of this. We want you to put this page together. Frankly, this one's actually pretty easy. I slimmed down this assignment a little bit. It's probably one of the easiest it's been. It's 6 areas with an icon, header, and text. And then there's a funny little box at the bottom here, which might give you a bit of a headache. But we want you to make that. The tricky thing with the third task is that it's the one task where we expect your page to not just be a fixed size, but to actually look OK when people resize the web browser. Right? How does it look on mobile is a question you might have heard before. That kind of thing. So there's actually an alternate view that we want you to do for mobile at the same time. And the lectures cover this in particular, I think a couple of lectures in week 2. All the text here is, I randomly wrote it. That's why none of it makes sense, because I went and found real websites, and then I just went and changed all the text to things that, 10 out of 10 interest rates doesn't make any sense. built-in calendar will help you track your, it's all just BS. So that's the assignment. That's assignment 1. You can start that pretty quickly. There's a few extra tips here about how you analyze the pages, because the 2 common questions are like, what color is that square? You know? And then the other question is, how big is that square? So we've got some tips on the tools you can use there. Just use Google Chrome in this course. Google Chrome's a pretty good browser. It works on every operating system. I'm a big Firefox lover historically, but just for your sake, it's easier if you use Chrome. It kind of doesn't matter though, because if I can be honest with you, most web browsers these days are all the same. They all do pretty good things. If you go back like 10 years, web browsers used to produce wildly different results. People used to write like whole different sections of CSS for like different web browsers, because they'd all, because you got to remember, a web browser is like a compiler. So you think about C, there's a couple of compilers for C, right? Like Clang and libc, like all this stuff I don't understand even. So, but C is like a language, and then people have to implement the compiler to interpret that language as best they can. Web browsers are the same. There's like a definition of what CSS is and how it works, and web browsers do their best to like interpret that code and render it how the spec says it should. These days, web browsers all kind of produce pretty much the same thing. It's incredible. Back in the day, decade ago, they didn't. I heard a funny story. When I was interning at Microsoft a very long time ago, and my boss's boss used to be the lead test engineer for Internet Explorer 4, which God knows when that would have been. But he was telling me that Netscape, which was their competitor, who's heard of Netscape? Yeah, great. Netscape's like the OG web browser.
Shit, a solution, actually.
That's what the Zoomers say, right? OG?
What the heck is front face?
Yeah, good. So Netscape implemented their interpreter of CSS all wrong. It had a whole bunch of bugs in it, but the problem is at the time 90% of websites were kind of built just for Netscape. So the developers had like written all these like this bad code to make the right website. And then when Internet Explorer tried to challenge Netscape, they implemented the CSS properly, but it didn't work with all the hacky code people had written to fix all the Netscape problems. So Internet Explorer had to write in a whole bunch of hacky stuff themselves to make their browser crap so that the websites would work. And then 10 years later, when Netscape was dead, Internet Explorer, everyone hated it because it was like nothing rendered properly, because they were just trying to match what Netscape was doing. So there's a whole wild history of web that is interesting or boring, I guess, depending on your perspective. The marking criteria for this assignment is really simple. You get half your marks for whether it looks right. So your tutor loads up your page. They look at the other thing and they say, yep, looks right. There's a bit of tolerance to like a couple of pixels. You know, they're not going to get there with like a micro ruler. But you'll be able to tell pretty easily. Like if you like look at it and it looks identical at like a quick 1 second glance, then that's like enough for the tutor. So don't like rack your brain about a couple of pixels. The other half of the marks comes from code quality. So like, is your code clean? Did it, like there's a bunch of criteria here, but you can kind of see this in the CSS lectures. We touch on it a little bit, but if you're unsure about anything, you can post on the forum. The good thing about HTML and CSS is it's pretty straightforward. You indent your work, you give things meaningful names, you avoid repetition. All of these things we know as developers, you don't really need to go into some hyper depth of knowledge there. Don't plagiarize. We will find you. I don't want to say we always find people, because obviously we don't. And someone out there is like, I've never been caught. But all I'd say is like every single term I tell people this horror story. I had a student in a course once, and they were like my tutor in another course, and they like plagiarized. And we gave them 0, but like they were like ranked 2nd in the course before they plagiarized. I'm not sure if that means they plagiarized everything else actually, but doesn't matter. But don't do it. You don't learn anything. You're paying like $1,000 to be here, or like 4,000 or something if you're don't have PR. So don't waste your time. It's due Monday, 10 a.m. So it's due in 2 weeks. There's a command when you're done. This will submit your master branch up on GitLab. I want to make this really clear. Don't just run this command randomly on your computer and hope that magic happens. The main thing is to make sure that your code is up to date on GitLab. Now, very quickly, let's say you start this assignment all you have to do is click clone, and then you simply have to open up a terminal, and then you simply just clone the assignment, and then all of your files are here now. Right? So if you want to start task 1, I can go into task 1, and I see now I have a web page called index.html, and that's my web page. So if I write hi here, I can probably even open this up in, can I open this up in, how do you, Chrome, Root?
Image background.
Okay, sure. Give me a second. I'm on my work laptop, so I just need to, I need to very quickly pause because I need to find the file and there's like sensitive work stuff.
Nice background. Include the eris.jpg in the background.
Hi. So this is like the folder that
they have the dog?
Everything's in here. And here's the cool thing about web. I can take that task 1 and I can literally drag that into the web browser here, and there's my web page. Right? The browser's kind of compiling the code. And now all I do for assignment 1 is I just go and like edit this. Now obviously I'd normally edit this in an editor, but you can just come along and you can go and write HTML like this. So you have, you know, really bold text. No one ever writes anything in terminal for this. Like, don't mistake me doing this right now as anything to do.
With the gray background.
I can go and make a link to Google. The pre-recorded lectures cover all of this stuff. And many of you might have seen this really basic stuff before. It keeps thinking we're in Vietnamese for some reason. I don't know why. And then we could write some CSS later. You know, you'll see some CSS. Again, you'll see this in the pre-records. If I want to say, make my text blue. Blue text.
Why is this a thing?
Like that. So assignment 1 is just that, but on steroids. Just a lot of that. It's a lot of that with a lot more HTML, a lot more CSS. And all you have to do is do that in 3 HTML files. And then we're done. So you have 2 weeks to do that. Any questions about that?
It's just a dog.
Ah, yeah, okay.
Toggle the position property. What do you
That's
mean,
a good question. So the question was just for people who can't hear or on the recording. So the question was, is HTML typically written, is a website typically written in one file, or is it broken up across many files? What I'd say is that CSS and JavaScript are typically stored in separate files. So like if you have a web page, typically you'll put your CSS and your JavaScript in separate files. And in fact, for assignment 1, we'd recommend you put your CSS in a separate file anyway. It's really disorienting seeing that play.
That's one way to do it.
HTML is a bit more complicated because like kind of old school web, every single different web page would be a different HTML file. But a lot of modern stuff that we'll do in the course is often one HTML file with a lot of JavaScript that makes it seem like many files. But the short story is that typically you will externalize your CSS and JavaScript.
What do you mean with respect to the outline element? I'm not going to respect the outline.
I would recommend when you start, you just write it all in one file. It's like when you program, right? You don't go and break something up into 6 functions before it even works. You know, you just like hack a little bit till it works, and then you're done. Turan says, I can't find task1/text.txt. So if we are missing something, we will push an update out to your repo. There was an issue where a couple things were missing that we kind of rolled out today. So if you do feel like if something is there or shouldn't be there, keep an eye on this merge request tab. If this says the number 1, you want to click on it. There might be some like updates to like suck into your code. If you're not sure on that, post on the forum or go to a help session and we can help you out there. Quick question, does task 1 have the text and assets? It should be there. Again, just post on the forum.
Background position center.
And Domestic has said that. Infinite Hayden, that sounds awful. Cool, okay, I mean, that's like it. Pretty light. I also don't like to drag you here too late. That's the other thing we got to be careful with in-person. I'll try and make sure that we zip through them because a lot of you get to the... Who's just like thinking about what they're going to eat for dinner now? Is anyone just like completely lost in food?
Position and size.
All right.
That's crazy.
Any other questions before we wrap up tonight? The exam is online.
Alright, we're done with that, I guess.
I mean, when people say in-person, usually that means in-person closed book. I don't really know what an in-person open book exam is. I guess it means we can watch you not talk to people. But yeah, it's all online. The exam's totally online. It's a very chill adult-like course, but just do the work, and you'll find it pretty manageable. If you do have any other questions, please post on the forum. And lastly, just a big thank you to everyone as well for putting up with some of the technical difficulties today. Good luck for the rest of the week, and I'll send you an email on Friday.
Okay, next one. Icebreaker. Icebreaker? Why am I doing an icebreaker now? Oh, it is ordered weirdly. Okay. Finish lecture 1, which is nice. Tutor will introduce themselves and the tutor will show you in groups of 3. Send. Ability learning should be pretty awful. Short training. You'll come back and discuss together. Wow, done. Done week 1. Let's go. Should we start week 2? Oh, I can watch the other lecture while I start week 2. HTML fundamentals. Do I really need this? Oh, wait, there's no video for it. Wait, what? Oh no, there is a video. I don't need to watch this, right? Yeah, no. Wouldn't that just be a waste of my time? CSS rules. Do I need to watch this? Surely not. What's more tags?
Hi, my name's Hayden, and today we're going to be talking about cascading style sheets, or what you may have more often heard is that a div ID is read. They don't have an underline like they kind of used to until you put your mouse over it, and that's what indicates that it's an actual. It should come first. Get these kinds of conflicts. The one that wins is typically exclamation mark important now.
Okay, what's the next one? CSS formatting. Flexbox, CSS layouts. CSS formatting.
Hi, my name, for instance, 1.5 is 50. I'll say like, actually, you know what? The background is that URL, this. So you see you got this. But what CSS can do in 5 years is very different. So in the past, for instance, contain and cover didn't exist. To read if you want. It's just like a bottomless pit, you know? There's things you learn every single day and you'll never stop learning. Unless your full-time job for years is going to be CSS, you'll always be uncovering new things. These are all different types of formatting. Obviously, you could also actually do things like you could set the color here. We've previously talked about if I make it 500, it'll grow the size of the image. And 20 pixels from the right, you know, a certain size, but the text that's entered using words to describe the color. But there are other common ways that we describe color. One of the obvious ones is the RGB, identical, and just like nice color, and then I come along here and oh cool, there you go, done. Nice. That's the color I want. So
this layouts. What do you mean layouts?
Hi, my box, if you will. And I'm going to close the span. You'll see the difference between these two types of elements. When I load this page up, you'll see that a div is always interested in taking up the full width. And you might think it's not taking up the full width, it's just taking up that 200 pixels. But what a div will do is if your element is only some of the page in width, it will kind of margin fill the right-hand side. You can kind of see this. I'm going to use the dev tools. This comes up in another lecture, but you can see here that, particularly if I make this full screen, that this particular div here, where is it? You can see that there's the element, there's the padding in that kind of green color, the border, and then the margin on the outside. But because it's a block element, it moves the margin all the way to the end for us. So that's what a block element does. Now you can kind of make anything a block element if you really try, as opposed to these span elements down here that don't take up the full size. You notice when I look at these, they just occupy their immediate space. Spans are not very versatile compared to divs, which is why we generally only use them for text. And you'll see that if I try and do fun things with them, like say a width of 200 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, you know, a background of green, what's going to happen here is that so this is called an inline, not a block. They kind of don't really care about layout. That's why you don't really use spans for layout. You mostly only use it for text because it kind of disregarded my width and my height here. Now I can make a span a block by simply saying display block. Now display block turns it into a block element, and now I start to get interesting things like this. And you can see that if I add a 5 pixel margin to it, we have now some block elements. And similarly, I can make my div an inline like a span by doing that. Now obviously that's crazy what just happened there. Now what went on? Well, the height and width were basically ignored and there was no pad out margin. So you still see we've still got the basics like padding and margin and the border. These can all apply to both inline and block elements, but we've lost in particular the kind of auto fill margin at the end, and the width is also kind of ignored. So width and height are ignored and there's no margin pad out. So what we've really done here is we've just kind of made a div a span and a span a div, which is kind of pointless. But I mentioned earlier that, you know, spans and divs are styleless components, but you can kind of just imagine a div as an element with no styles that just is display block, and you can imagine a span that's an element with no styles with just display inline. So that's why they're kind of really commonly used, because they're just two fundamental types with not a lot of opinionated styles. But obviously you would rarely actually use display block and display inline in your CSS. You can though, that's for sure. Sometimes you might have paragraphs or something that you want to display block with them. I mean, most of the time you'll probably see that paragraphs are display block, I'd imagine. I haven't checked, probably a good thing to check, but that's the basics of block elements. And you can go and play around with these in many different ways, but inline and block are the two main things. There's a few other types of displays you can use, but generally speaking, we just stick with inline and block. One of the most other ones is the inline block, and this one's kind of interesting. Inline block is this like halfway point. I might touch on it as like it will give you some of the block aspects, but not all of it. So if I do inline block, this kind of Frankenstein middle ground, what it does is it kind of gives you the width and height, but it doesn't block out the lines. So you saw before that an inline element ignores width and height. Display inline block will give you a width and height, but it won't kind of start and finish on a new line. That's sometimes really useful if you kind of just want blocks to exist next to each other and not take up new lines. But they're the three, like if you use block, and inline, you'll get away with most things you need to do in this space. Whilst we're on the topic of display, there's also another display value that you can give the display key, which is none, which basically means to hide something. So for instance, let's say I come down here and I want to add a class to this particular box. What are frogs? And that class is going to be hide. If I give it a display of none, that will hide the box. So display none is essentially how you hide stuff in CSS. That might sound silly for now because you're like, why would I hide something? Why would I write the job and then hide it? Well, this will make more sense as we touch on JavaScript and everything later. So that's display none, but we also have a similar thing, which is visibility hidden. Now the difference between visibility hidden and display none is that visibility hidden will actually place it on the page with the right size. It will just not make it visible. So you see here, this actually, it's like it's here, but you know, it's like the Harry Potter cloak thing. It's just like, there's something there, but you just can't see it. The display none actually removes it and kind of like cuts the element off the page. Visibility hidden is probably not as useful as display none. As you'll learn in later work and assignments, display none is extremely useful with kind of being able to chop and change what's visible on the page. But that's the basics of block, the display tag essentially. Now we're going to get into a few of the simple ways to lay out blocks on your web page. We're going to be talking about float. We're going to be talking about position, and then we'll also talk about tables a little bit, maybe. So, and they're kind of mutually exclusive. They don't build on each other. They're just different ways of doing something. So firstly, float. Float is a very weird thing, and you should probably avoid it. It's very old, and I create a, let's call it my floater. And that floater is going to have a bunch of smiley faces in it. And I go and give some styles to my floater, which might be, say, width 50 pixels, height 50 pixels, background is purple, like that. You'll see our element appears there. However, if I float it to the left, here's what you'll notice. Suddenly, it kind of just appears up and above. It's really like, you can kind of imagine a web page normally is this kind of like one piece of paper where everything has to organize on it. But the word float quite literally means, like, imagine it floating up above and like sitting to the side. Now, I can also give these things margins if I want to. Like if I gave it a 10 pixel margin, you'll see that it kind of pushed some things away. And what you'll notice, and this is very weird behavior, and this is why floats have to probably generally be avoided, is that it pushed the text aside, all the inline elements, but it left the block elements there. So very, very odd. For instance, if I give it a 20 pixel margin, now that kind of like keeps pushing that across. Now you might be like, what in the world is this useful for? Well, probably the most common classical way that floats were used before we had better tooling, I guess you could say, is that you might actually create yourself, say, a sidebar. And that sidebar might be a, 300 pixel height. It might be a 50 pixel width. You might float it to the left. And then what you'll typically do is you'll typically have an element after that sidebar, and I'll just use styles here, that might have a margin left of 50 pixels like this. And it might have a height itself of 300 pixels. Rest of content. So this was kind of like how a lot of old responsiveness used to happen, was you'd have your kind of normal, I'll make that background gray. Like this, you'd have your kind of normal content here, and you'd play around a lot with the margins, and you say, okay, the margin top might be 10 pixels too. Oh, it didn't like that. That's okay. You might have to give it a slightly larger left margin because of like, and then it gets really tricky because you're like, oh, now I have to like do 50 pixels for the floating left and then 10 pixels for its margin. And like, sure, you get this nice little page now where I have this sidebar that kind of floats with the page. That's really how, that's the probably one of the more original ways to use float, but it's very cumbersome, and there are just better ways to do things these days. But you'll still see float around a lot, and in particular, float is actually used probably most commonly. I don't know why that looked up bluefish. That was weird. It's probably used most commonly when it comes to pages that have these like elements like this here. Notice that's very floaty. These things here. Notice like they're just kind of chucked there and text just wraps around it. So it's again, it's a really old school thing, and it kind of makes sense for how the internet used to originate, which was these elements kind of tucked away. So you can see it when you look for it, but generally you're probably not going to find an extensive use for it. The only other point with float is that sometimes, for instance, you might have an element that is not the full, oops, that's not what I wanted. Sometimes you might have an element that's not the full height, and you get this weird effect here. Also notice this gray box, I did not have to specify its width, because by default all divs are full width. And if you restrict the width, they will be that width plus margin padding out the rest of the side. But if you kind of have this float scenario and you think, you know what, all these boxes here with frogs, I want them to just exist below the float. You can actually use this weird style called clear both, or clear left, or clear right, but clear both is pretty common, where it will kind of be like, all right, let's go find the floats, let's just like go to the bottom of them, and let's put the content underneath. So cute, but again, would probably try and avoid a little bit. A lot of the rest of this lecture, we have a few slides on position. That's where most of the time we're going to spend comes from. And position is a really interesting property. It's I would say it's still it's an old one, but it's still used relevantly today. You're probably not going to use it very much, but when you do use it, you'll be like, okay, that's very useful. There are 4 different types of positions that we can give our elements on a web page. I might just kind of push this stuff down a little bit. Yeah. So the 4 types of positions are, you can either do static, relative, absolute, or fixed. They're the 4, and they're the 4 we're going to talk about. Now, every single HTML element by default has a static position. And a static position does not mean much very fancy. It means that the position is just normal, the element just behaves. The static value is the default property for position. And if you don't need to worry about static because we never really deal with it. But where things start to get interesting is when we look at the other 3, in particular relative. So a relative positioned element, if you put position relative on a CSS selector, will position the element based on the normal flow, but it will offset it left, right, top, and bottom compared to its default position. So we can, play around with this as an example if we'd like. I might just comment this out so you can still see it. Well, let's say I have this div in here, and I'm going to call it like outer, and then I'm going to create another div inside of it called inner, like that. And when I get the outer, I'm going to just maybe give it a width of 300 pixels, a height of 300 pixels. And for the inner, I'm going to play with it and say that I want its position to be relative. Let's see what happens here. So I'm going to color these backgrounds different colors. We'll go yellow and green because they're kind of ugly together. We've got our yellow and green backgrounds. Okay, so there you see, there's your, the outer one has a certain width and height because we've set it. The inner one has a default width of 100% because it's a block element, but it has no height. But maybe let's play around with that. Maybe let's say that the width should be 50 pixels and the height should be 50 pixels. So now we've got this 50 by 50 element inside here. But because we've set it with position relative, I can start doing interesting things like giving it one of the top, left, right, or bottom properties. Now, what this does is this offsets the element relative to its parent. So in this case here, top of 10 pixels, left of 10 pixels means move me 10 pixels down from the top and 10 pixels from the left. If you say things like bottom, it will actually send it to the other side. Well, in this case, it's a little bit, sorry, not bottom. Let's try these out. So you'll notice what right and bottom do is a little bit confusing. And that's because with the relative position, everything is quite literally relative to that top left area. And you'll see this as well. If I just do, say, left of negative 10 pixels, we'll get the exact same effect. So you can kind of picture this magical point at this top left yellow here where everything's kind of centered around. Position relative is mostly used to kind of move, pad things across from that side there. So you'll see it's pretty simple. You don't always have to use pixels. You can actually use percentages as well. So you could actually say 10% from the left or 10% from the right. Not super common, but that's an easy way to kind of, well, in this case, it won't matter because the div doesn't grow. But let's say we got rid of the width of the outer div. So now as we actually make this page bigger, you'll see that the position of high kind of drifts towards the middle slightly. So it's always that, 10% from the left. Now, position relative, I would say, is probably not used a ton. It is kind of interesting, but the much more common thing you're going to use is the absolute position. And the absolute position is a lot like relative. But with the relative position, let's look at the language. It will offset properties based on its default position. The absolute position will offset properties based on the closest parent with a non-static position. I find this stuff really confusing. But essentially, what absolute means is that when you go left, top, right, bottom, and all that kind of stuff, it will look at the parent div that is position not static, and you can move it to the right, to the bottom. Whereas what we're doing with relative, you can only kind of have it relative to its normal position. Relative, you got to think of it like relative does not understand anything about the parent, right? So when I was doing this here, even though it's in this yellow box, it does not really does not understand anything. It doesn't really have a sense of the parent, say, height, which is why when we tried to do something like, say, I want you to be 10 pixels from the bottom, it doesn't like that. It just kind of, the bottom and the top, it's all the same point. It's just the starting point up here. However, a really common pattern you'll see is that you make an outer element relative, like this, and then you make the inner element absolute. And now what'll happen is that this element, you can move it anywhere around the kind of outer parent, top, left, right, bottom. So if you want this to kind of be in the bottom right, you can actually just say bottom 10 pixels, right 10 pixels. And now suddenly we've got this element over there. So that's just really handy, right? Now, obviously you can kind of do this with floats if you wanted to, but it's a bit of a nightmare. So let's say you had a div and you wanted it to be, you wanted two inner elements, and you wanted one of them to be, say, the right element and the left element. Well, now we can, combine a few things we've been working on and say, well, they're all the properties for inner, but what I'm going to say now is that anything inside of outer that is value left will simply be left 10 pixels, and anything in outer that's class right is right 10 pixels, like that. So now we kind of have our two boxes, and they'll kind of scale in and out. So position absolute is super, super useful. I would use position absolute for many things in terms of placements. Usually the only area I'd often use position relative for is maybe to do with text. You see some examples on the slide here in terms of relative. But the thing is, a lot of what you do with position relative, you can kind of often solve with margins and padding because you're just kind of offsetting an element. So you probably use it sparingly, but it still has some use cases. But absolute's super common, I'd say, because there are just lots of times where you might just want to put something at the bottom. Or let's say we don't have these two things, or you want, like we talked about the right-hand sidebar before. So imagine what happens if we say, well, I want a position absolute element. I want it to have a width of 100 pixels. I want it to have a height of 100%, the full height, and I want it to be attached to the right, like that. Now, and I'll give it a background of red. There you go, done. There's like, a really simple sidebar. So super, super powerful. You need to remember again that all position absolutes have to exist within a position relative parent. You'll notice that if I drop the position relative on the parent, everything starts to go whack. But you'll notice it still seems to be stuck to the right. Why is that? And that's because it's not that like the immediate parent has to be position relative or not static technically. It's that it's going to try and look for the closest one and make itself absolute to that. So in this case, it attached itself to the body because the body is kind of like the outermost element. So similarly, if you, let's say we had an element that was outside of our outer, right? So we go and we take this and we make it even on the outside, and then we give it, say, a height of 800 pixels and a background of black.
It disappeared.
If we make it position relative, you'll see that it will attach itself to that now, right? Which makes sense because this div is the closest non-static parent to the absolute elements that we were creating here. Whereas if the outer has a position relative, it will kind of go absolute to that. So a little bit of playing around. I find, you can even hear it from my language, I find talking about positions a little bit challenging sometimes. I find them a bit weird, but you just get used to a few simple use cases. And the last use case, which is one of those things that I use often but not much, is the fixed position. And the fixed position doesn't have all those fancy rules that I talked about. It basically just fixes itself on the screen. So we saw before that when we were playing around with these green squares, when we were setting things like left, top, bottom, and right, that was all relative to the closest non-static element. But if we make something position fixed, it doesn't really care about elements. It's like it's going to make itself relative to the window, quite literally. So let's say, and this is really useful for things like, say, a pop-up. So let's imagine that I'll show you a couple of things here. So let's imagine that I have an element, and you know what, I might make this one a class. I'll call it my pop-up. This is something you might do. I make a pop-up, and inside the text is like, don't forget to sign up, like this. But we think, I don't want that to just sit up the top there. I want it to kind of float above things. Now, You'd think you'd use float for that, but not necessarily. Let's give it a width of 300 pixels, a height of 50 pixels. We'll give it a background of black. We'll make its font color white. And that'll just look like a black white box now, right? We will text align center it. And I'll also make this a bit smaller so that it kind of looks more appropriate. Like that. Don't forget to sign up. Now, the text looks kind of awkward there, so I might give it a padding on the top of 10 pixels. Now, this is really interesting because you've noticed here I've used padding top, and you would have seen before I used margin left. We talked previously about compound definitions, and similarly, with CSS, you have padding bottom, padding top, padding left, padding right. You have all these different kinds of things, and you can represent them all. You can kind of compress them all together, for instance, by just putting all four together, like that. Oops, not padding top. Like if you just use like the compound thing, you get that. And there's a few different ways to do padding. If you do like just padding X pixels, this will apply a border to all four sides. If you do padding X pixels, X pixels, X pixels, X pixels, it'll go top, right, bottom, left. I don't know. Top, right, bottom, left. I think I mirrored. Maybe not. It was awkward. And if you just do two is really interesting because it does top, bottom, left, right. So in this particular case, I only needed one side, so I could just do padding top and I get my result. Oops, need to just have one. But if say I wanted to be super explicit, I could have used padding and been like, well, I want the padding to be 10 at the top, right down left, so that's 0, 0, 0, like that. And there's the padding. Now, back to the positioning, if I do position fixed, what this will do is it will now float up above everything else on the page. Now you notice that, I don't know where it went. Let's get rid of this other black background. Very confusing. There you go. So you see there, it's actually kind of hidden behind that other element. Isn't that interesting? Now we have a lecture on Z-index about this. You should go check out that lecture. There's some ways we talk about how elements sit above each other, but for now, don't worry about that. You won't come across that a ton, but you can go watch that lecture if you'd like to. So we have this element now, and it's fixed on the page, which means you notice when we scroll, it always stays relative to the viewport, to the window. We can do some other fun things, like we can, you can move it 10 pixels off the top, like that, or say 50 pixels off the top. Easy. And then you think, oh, well, what if I want it to be in the middle? Well, there's a couple of things we could try. We could try doing this. Now, this doesn't really work, but I want to show you, this doesn't work in this scenario, but I want to show you this as well, because it's something really common you're going to want to do. I'll come back to that, but let's wrap this up. Is you can actually say left, say 100 pixels, but maybe you want it to be right in the middle, so you say 50%. That makes sense, halfway. But the problem is that will start the element halfway through the page. So this line here is the dead middle. So then you think, oh, okay, I want it to be 50%, but minus a little bit. And there's so many layers to CSS. But one really cool thing that was introduced, I think with CSS 3, was the calc function. And the calc function actually let you kind of do this math where CSS would figure it out for you. So you can see what I've done here is said, I actually want you to be 50% minus 90 pixels, which is half of the width here. Now, there are cleaner ways to do this, of course, but that's a good starting point. So now we have this little pop-up that just kind of appears on the page. It's pretty cute. And that pretty much wraps up fixed position. Like that's the kind of stuff you do with fixed position. Before we get on to overflow, there are two final little kind of tidbits about CSS that are probably worth tying in to this lecture just because we're already talking about CSS. And that one is, how do I center a div? Really common thing you'll do is you'll have a 300 pixel div. It'll be like a hi, it'll be some text like this, and it'll look like that. How do I center that? Well, if you actually give things a left margin of auto and a right margin of auto, it's a little bit of a bad, confusing way to do it. What auto means is like kind of autofill. And if you put auto on both sides, it will kind of equally autofill the margins on both sides. There's a shorthand way to do this, which you would have seen me do before, which is margin 0 order, which actually makes a lot of sense because that's saying the margin is 0 top, 0 bottom, and then auto left and right, right? Because that compound one is top, bottom, left, right. And that's the shorthand way to essentially center divs. So you can center divs really, really easily like that if you'd like to. This is totally unrelated to the position thing. It's just something that kind of that came to mind. So yeah, that's a lot of things on CSS layouts. Now, overflow. Last thing for the layouts lecture. When it comes to overflow, this is mostly about text. And it is mostly when you have blocks where text may get bigger than the block can handle. So if we say we have a look at our high box here, let's imagine we add lots and lots and lots and lots of highs. Oop, wrong one. There we go. We have lots and lots of highs. You'll see that it actually just like overflows out of the box. This is pretty normal behavior. This is just how kind of standard web was designed. But if you give that particular box an overflow property, you can either say that the content should be visible, as in it just renders outside the edges, that it will be hidden, which means it just cuts it off, or scroll, some of the most popular ones, which hides the content with a scroll. So if we come back to our high here, we can say add a style, which might be like overflow hidden, which will hide it now. Or we could make it overflow scroll, which will make a little scrolly window. It's kind of cute, isn't it? Yeah. So that's a few other ways you can overflow. That's a little tidbit with the layouts as well. Now, obviously there's lots more you can do with layouts. There's another lecture on flex and some of the other more modern ways to lay things out. A lot of the time you're just going to have to be Googling, using examples, looking at websites. There are these great websites where, like CSS Tricks, which we're going to reference a few times, where you can look at different ways to lay things out. You know, they've got everything here, like moving backgrounds, fancy hover. Like there's so much depth. Like at these big tech companies, there will be people whose like full-time job is to be CSS masters. And they're always going to be learning. So it's a bit of a bottomless pit, so don't beat yourself up too hard if you feel like not everything is immediately obvious, but keep going and you'll slowly build up a little bank of knowledge about how to lay things out. Laying things out will feel like the hardest part of CSS, and it just takes time to get used to it. If you get stuck, go try and find an example online of something you want to do, or describe what you want, and you'll often find code samples. But other than that, thank you very much. I hope that was interesting.
Kinda like a square, whatever. Yeah, no, it's definitely double. Background X gotta be like 10. I didn't listen to any of that.
Hi, my name's Hayden, and today we're going to be talking about layouts, and in particular Flexbox, which is an extension of the layouts lecture, where we talk about something similar to float and similar to position, absolute, relative, except Flexbox is for modern web. It's something that is much more recent in the CSS library, and it's a response to the need to have more responsive websites, which is essentially websites that look good at different sizes and have dynamic content. A really good example is if you just go to the course website, you'll notice that as we zoom in here, these boxes all kind of magically resize and reshape themselves. And that's built using a Flexbox. It's a very, very powerful tool. It's very complicated in the sense that there's a lot of different options that you can use. So it will feel like it takes you a while to get used to it. But today we're going to be going through a few basic examples. Now, these slides highlight some very kind of the main properties of Flexbox that you want to use. We have 3 or 4 slides here. We're going to check out a website where we can see more of them. But just to start, let us explore something that is pretty common, which is that I might have myself a container, and inside that container I have myself a box. And we can go and code these. We've got ourselves a container here, and then we have a box inside there. And we've got 3 boxes, and let's just put letters inside of each box, A, B, C. And the boxes will give, say, we don't need to give them a width, but let's say we'll give them a background of blue. So now you can see we've got 3 boxes here, A, B, C. Maybe we'll give them just a little bit of a margin, just so you can more immediately see what's going on. Now, you might be thinking, I'd really like to get those arranged in a line, you know, like 3 boxes together. And you could come up with some good ideas for that. You could come up with width 33%. Something like this might work, right? But then you have to figure out, how do I get them to appear one next to each other? And then you start thinking, we'll do what we did last time, we'll display inline block. But then this doesn't quite work because 33% plus 33% plus 33% plus 1 pixel margins, you know, you've got this problem now where the 1 pixel margins are creating havoc. You can see they've got some padding around them, some white space, because there's actually white, like here's the funny part, there's actually a space between these 2 divs, like that. So you kind of have to remove that space to make this work. And then if you add the margin in, this will probably work because, you know, 33% plus 33% plus 33% is only 99. But once I start putting in, and there you go, even bigger margins aren't helping at all. So, you know, there needed to be a way to do this better. And that's where Flex comes in. And that's what you see on the lecture slide. So if we get rid of that and we just have our 3 boxes that are blue, you can see that everything in Flex generally is made up of a parent or container and children. And the container is what houses the elements that you're trying to display flexibly, and the children are those flexibly displayed items. So the next step is that if we want to use Flexbox, we use display flex on the parent. That's the key thing to remember. So I've got these items here and I do display flex. So instead of display block or display inline or display inline block, Flex was a new type of display added to, I'm not sure which version of CSS. So you can see there I've got my A, B, C, but they're not evenly spaced. And the reason they're not evenly spaced is because Flex has a whole bunch of properties that decide how things should be shaped. And one of the easiest places to go look at this is if you go to CSS Tricks and Flexbox, there's a great little explanatory website where they take you through essentially the 2 sets of properties, which are the properties for the parent, which is the container, and then the properties for the item. And if I just make this bigger, you'll see that they'll give you the basics like, okay, well, the parent should always be display flex. And then they show you some things here like flex direction. And this establishes which way the content flows. So you can see you can have it flow from left to right in a row, from right to left in a row, from top to bottom in a row, from bottom to top in a row. And to do that, you just have to add flex direction, which is another flex property of either row, row reverse, column, or column reverse. Now, you can see again, everything in this left-hand column of the page is for the container. That's really important to note. So if you're ever not sure where to put it. So let's say I come here and I say, well, flex direction is row. Well, that's exactly what we have. But when I put row reverse, you'll see that suddenly they all snap to the other side like they're trying to come across from right to left. Similarly, if I do column, you'll see now that they kind of are how they originally were. And if I do column reverse, they're all swapped around. So we can kind of play around with the direction that way. But let's just stick with row for now. Row's the default one, so I technically don't even really need to add that. The next thing is we might want to actually space these children around. So if we have a look at this example here, you can see that justify content is another property. And justify content is a property of the container as well. So as we come down here, you will see justify content. And justify content explains how things are placed within their direction. So you need to understand that flex is a container, and then flex
specifies which way does this flow. That's the flex direction. And then the justify content is how is this flow spaced. So you can see we've got one here called space between. So if I come back and I now say justify content, space between, that will do exactly what this diagram is showing me, which is that it will kind of space things out as evenly as possible. Sorry, wrong thing. Oopsie. So now we've got A, B, C like that. Now obviously these boxes might be a bit bigger. They might be something like, 50 pixels in size, and naturally you can text align center them, and you can add like a padding of 5 pixels. You can kind of clean it up a little bit, but you see there how it kind of, they're all spaced between, like it says. We could do things like center or space around or space evenly. Let's try those out. So let's say we do a justify content of center. Now they're all in the middle. Or if we do space around, they have space like that, or space. That's an even space around them. So each element has exactly the same number of pixels. And then this one is an equal space between them. Now that might look really similar to, sorry, what was that? Space, what did I write? Space between, space between was where we started. Meant to do space evenly. Some of these aren't as obvious when the elements are the same size. So for instance, space around and space evenly, I'm pretty sure matters more when you have different sized elements. But you can see we've also got flex start and flex end. And this is really interesting because this is how you get those different combinations where you say, if you do flex direction as row, which is from left to right, but then you justify content to flex end. That's saying I want to go A, B, C. I want my content to be, in that direction, but I want it all to be justified to the right. And similarly, we could flip that on its head and, let's say it should be row reverse with flex start, which will just... this is kind of funny. So row reverse puts it on the other side. Pay attention to the letters here, A, B, C. But flex start, because it's going from right to left, start now means put A on the right. So if I wanted to say, do ABC, that way it's like flex end. Because remember, the justify content is within the flex direction. So you have your flex container, your flex direction, and then you justify content within that flex direction. You can see so far that most of the things we're adding properties to happen on the container themselves. And then the children exist within inside of that. So we've talked about flex direction. We've also talked about justify content. But one of the things we haven't talked about is align items. And align items is essentially how elements will be fixed vertically typically. So if we come back here and we say align items center, now this won't do anything because the actual div the container's in has no height, so it kind of calculates its height based on the inner elements. But if I was to say give it a height of 500 pixels now, that'll be center aligned there. So that page is quite, I'm going to make this text white. So now that's center aligned, and just for, if I give this one a background of yellow, you'll see what I mean. So now that's center aligned, or if we want it to be, instead of center aligned, we can make it, let's find our align items. We can make them stretch, or we can make them flex end. So if we say stretch here, you'll see how they appear differently there. So now they're the full height. Whereas if we say flex end, that should move it to the bottom. And if we say flex start, that moves it to the top. So you can see here immediately, these three items give you the truest sense of what the main things you can do are, which is, you got your direction, you got your vertical alignment within that direction, and you got how they're spaced out, how they're justified, how their content is spread out. So that's most of the basics. There's a few other little properties that we might quickly chat to. So if you go back to the CSS tricks site, you'll see that there's flex wrap, and flex wrap. Let's go back to gone way too far down now. Go into the comments, I guess. Flex wrap is how you specify what happens when there's too much content. So, for instance, let's imagine, like right now, this page was okay because I only had a few boxes, right? But what happens once I start having a lot of boxes? Oops, sorry. So let's say I come along and I say, yep, let's have like 30 boxes or something. You see the default behavior is for it to just kind of run off the end. Let me move this back to the top. It's just to run off the end, whereas if I say flex wrap, I would like it to wrap. That content will start now wrapping down like this. You know, and you'll see as well, it starts wrapping down very evenly. So because my box is 500 pixels high, it wants to kind of, as it overflows, fill that space evenly. So you're like, oh, that doesn't look right. But typically you'll find that, you know, nearly everything here has a property. So for instance, we've got this like align content here. You're like, oh, align content, that looks interesting because they're lots of wrapped, and you can see they're all chunked at the top, chunked at the end, stretch, center, space between, space around. And you can see that, you know, the kind of default position is normal, which
it doesn't look like a
appears
space.
to not be any of those. But let's try playing with that one, align content. Let's see if this works. Align content, flex start. Oop, yeah, flex start. So now you can see it's all put up the top there. And if I said flex end, then the content's aligned to the bottom as it overflows. You know, so there's lots and lots of configuration. There's so much. There's so much more here. Most of the configuration's generally on the container, of course, but there's a few items of configuration on the actual elements themselves. Order is very interesting. The two I want to quickly touch on to round this out are order and flex. So quite often when you're making flex boxes, you aren't going to actually specify the explicit width of your container. Quite often you might do something like, say, I'll get rid of a bunch of these.
Where's the space?
Elements here. Instead of saying width, you might actually say something like flex 1. Now what flex 1 means is it's kind of like a proportioning system. So if you have 5 elements all with flex 1, then that means that all of those elements are going to take up like it's like a ratio, 1, 1, 1, 1. But if you wanted to come along and say, okay, well, this box is going to be a large box. So now we've got like a large box. This might have a flex of 2. So that means that they're going to be in the ratio 1, 1, 2, 1, 1. You know, so you can imagine it's like 1 space, 1 space, double space, 1 space, 1 space. So you see how this pans out now is that C is a little bit bigger. And you could make that even larger if you'd like to. You know, and flex is very smart. If you come along and you just simply make something a fixed size, like 50 pixels, it will actually go and see if that works. Maybe that was the current size. Oh, no, that's not working. So if you come along and you set something to be an actual explicit size, flex will then usually come and might need to turn flex off that one. Call it like small. Let's see how this goes. So let's say we say flex is 1, and we'll go and give these boxes a property of small. Okay, so now all of those have properties of small. Let's see what happens if we get rid of this.
Oh, okay, it works.
This bit, 50 pixels.
It wraps here.
Yeah, so you can see that A there, which I believe is over on the right.
But this shouldn't
Yeah,
be.
you can see it's actually 50 pixels, and you notice this, that as the screen, and if I give it a different background color of green, you notice it is actually a fixed size, and as the screen grows and shrinks, it stays the same size, but all the other elements kind of fill out the area proportionally. So that's really relevant because Flex is very smart with these Flex properties. You can also change the order of things. This is something I don't really do a lot. You know, if you want to make this one like order 3 or something like this, you can kind of move around where it is. But I generally find that can be a little confusing. You're probably not going to use that unless you're using a lot of JavaScript. But that's really it. The main takeaway here is that Flex is very powerful. It can do quite a lot of things. It's important to go and read the docs, and then also, more importantly, just play around with things. A great little website is Flexbox Froggy. This is on our resources page, but this is a fun little game where they will give you a frog and they'll say move the frog over to the lily pad. So you think, oh, how do I move? If the pond is the container, how do I move the frog over to the lily pad? Well, flex direction is probably row reverse. So it should start over on the other side. There you go, I won, you know, and then the next one, the next question's like, okay, these two need to be centered. So then I think, oh, okay, justify content, center. It's a fun little game, and it makes you really think and do things visually, which is good. And you know, you're like, oh no, this one's hard. It's like, okay, well, this was justify content. What was it? what was the space?
Justify content right.
Let's go. We go look at our CSS trick site, and we think, what was the one where they were kind of evenly spaced across it? And this is okay. Don't feel afraid to go Google stuff. We don't ever do any closed book exams. And you think, okay, space evenly looks okay, so we'll go space evenly. Yeah. Oh, not quite. What is it? Space between, maybe? Nope.
How do I?
You think, I don't know what that is. I've got that wrong. You know, you just play around with it for a while. Space around. Yay, you know, you figure it out. So this is a fun little game. Go play that, but just try it out. Play around. It's one of those things you just have to poke. So hope that's fun. Go use some flex boxes. Big learning curve, but very powerful.
Oh, they use the strong keyword. Use the strong. Oh. So strong instead. Huh? Where's the full stop? Oh, I deleted it. Why is there a space? Oh, that's why. Nice. So you put a tag within a tag, then it'll be inline. I think I'm good. Don't see how I could be wrong. Apart from this, like, lining up with the module, like, I can just do that. And it's correct-ish. Good enough, I reckon. Good enough, I reckon. How does it look on a web page? Could be worse. Could be worse. I could make this image separate instead of like a background image at 400, which is probably the minimum. Whatever. At 475, I reckon that's as good as it gets. Like, that probably can be improved, and that's just long words, whatever. So we've done this, done replicate simple flex. Surely I can do that. Sheesh, 90 minutes. Duplicate simple flex. What do you want? Use div tags to flex on a create a page that vaguely resembles this image. This image. Oh. That's interesting. How easily can you rotate the entire box by 90 degrees? Probably not very easily. I need to make that. Those three will be in the box. Okay.
Okay.
Div
Hello.
left.
Audio is still could definitely be louder. Hello. Okay. I hope that doesn't kill anyone's ears at home. Anyone watching the stream at home? None of you. If you could just tell me how that audio is. I've just turned it up like wildly high. I'll yell a lot
I feel like
more when
since
I'm
this is
talking.
such an easy
So
exercise.
if it's crazy, just let me know. Amazing.
I might as
Okay.
well. Wait, I
Half
didn't look at
time
the
this
answer
week.
for the previous question.
Only took us half the time. Hi. Get that off the stupid screen. How's everyone? Congrats for turning up. Who's enjoying turning up in person? What the hell are the rest of you doing? Weirdos. Thank you. We won't be having an in-person lecture next week. I'm not around, so next week will be online, so we can try that out, and then maybe we'll do in-person in week 4. I promised you at the start of the term, if you keep turning up in person, I'll keep turning up in person, or until the lecture
Please
quality
count
just goes pretty poorly.
body.
But again, thank you for being patient as we get set up today.
Use article image with the 100%.
How is everyone settling
Arclet
into the
in the
course?
body, and the body is padding.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's probably
Who's
the better
sad?
way to
Anyone
go.
sad? Sad hands? Couple of sad hands. Who started assignment 1? Hands up.
Well, they
Okay, congrats. That's a good start. Who's looked at assignment 1?
They made it a section, set up a div.
Less hands somehow. Who's anyone finished assignment 1? Okay, a few people. That's good. So, couple of, I guess, really quick housekeeping matters, because I know I send out these notices every week, and I try and get everything in one compact thing, so you don't have to read one thing a week. But that still
they
doesn't
did a
stop people
stupid hack
missing
there.
things.
Dummy.
Assignment 2, which was released before anyone kind of craps the bed, it's a really, really easy assignment. Previously, in previous terms, we used to have assignment 1, which was 4 questions, and all we've done is take a part out. Right? So it's not some big swanky dank thing. It's like, if you can do assignment 1, it's about like a third of that effort to do assignment 2. And in fact, I have like countless students, maybe half the students, maybe a third of students last term would tell me that like assignment 2 for them was like easier than a single question in assignment 1, right? So I don't want you to have this like looming horrible thing of like, oh my God, there's an assignment due on Monday, and then I have another one due the following Monday. It's actually really like manageable. That's why I genuinely recommended that you all kind of start it next week. It's the kind of thing that you can just like smash out in a week pretty easily. Particularly if you've programmed before, and most of you have programmed before, right? Great, yay. What we're going to be focusing on today is what's going to be the case for most lectures this term, which is demos. So usually what we do in these lectures is we kind of wrap up some of the content for the last week. So this last week, it's all been HTML, CSS. Next week, it's all kind of the basics of JavaScript. The following week, in week 4, it's all like web JavaScript. It's all the stuff that assignment 2's on, where you kind of manipulate web pages to do certain things, and then so on and so forth. So today, we're literally just doing a demo of a lot of the stuff we've learned last week. On the tram here, I found a random website that we're going to code up today, or like try and code up, try and emulate. And hopefully in that, we can touch on some of the key elements of what you've been learning the last week, right? Because you kind of learned a little bit about fonts, and then there was that animations thing that no one probably watched, and for good reason. And then, you know, we had who watched the CSS showcase lecture?
Top left is...
That's a good number. That's about how many I'd hope would watch it, right? Like that's why, who didn't watch it because it was marked as extension? Great, okay, it works. Sometimes I get really nervous that like you put these things in front of students and they're like, I'm extension, and then they all watch it, right? But today, actually first, does anyone have a website they really love? We could maybe look at that. If anyone has a better suggestion, I'd be happy to consider it. That's okay. Just checking. So we're literally just going to build a page from scratch really quick. Again, I'm conscious in person that people get hungry and stuff, so we're going to not try and run till 8 o'clock or anything like that. And also the pre-recorded lectures, I'm pretty sure are more than 2 hours a week, even the mandatory ones. So don't want to completely crush you there. Now, the website that I picked today is a website that I really like. Well, it's not really a website I like, it's a product I like. It's called Airtable. I generally don't love a ton of products on the internet. I'm a bit of a grumpy person a lot of the time, but Airtable's a product I found like 5 years ago and I just loved it. In fact, we use it to power Eccles, the website. So if I just like pull that up, for instance, I can probably pull it up in another, what have I got here? So if I can actually pull up how the course website runs. So all the stuff you see on Eccles is actually in this Airtable here. So all the tutorials that you see, for instance, here, they're all just listed here. When there's someone who changes a help session time, we just update it here. All the lectures you see. So sometimes some of you will say things like, "Oh, the lecture duration is wrong," or maybe you'll say something like, "You know, the name's wrong, or there's a PDF missing." I just go and update these things here. So the actual website itself is kind of drawn from this database, if you will, right? Now this is unrelated to anything to do with the course. I'm just giving some context on this random website. It's basically like Google Sheet, except it has like a schema-like structure, more like a database, if anyone's played around with SQL. So it's a cool little mix. But I was like, Airtable, cool. That was a random product. So I looked
okay.
up their website and I saw this and I was like, okay, well, we got a pretty simple website. We got a little icon logo. We got some nav bar items. We've got some buttons. We've got a sign in. You know, lots of things down. This little thing keeps wobbling about up the top left there. That's kind of cool. I don't know how that happens. I don't do a lot of CSS animation day to day, so I see something like that and I'm like, I'm sure a quick Google will help me out, but beyond that, I'm not too sure. We see a bunch of stuff here. It's a pretty simple website, which is kind of why I picked it. And if we go into mobile mode, which if you've watched the pre-recordings, which you all have from week 1, if I just press F12, as we shrink it down, you can see that it starts to behave slightly differently where things come in a little bit. Now, if you have finished or done assignment 1, a lot of what we're going to talk about right now might not be super interesting because this is probably more of a recap for you. Ways that you can see I might do something differently to you, either in a better or worse way. I'm certainly not the world's best front-end programmer. I've just been doing a little bit of it for a long time. And for those who haven't started, hopefully this gives you the confidence to start if you haven't watched the tutorials already, which there are lots and lots of them to check out. Okay, so let's say you have a web page like this. Now let's start desktop first. Now if you're a beginner, I generally wouldn't get too caught up in the whole how's it all going to look mobile and desktop. So question 3 of assignment 1 has that small and the big view. If you're starting off, start with one of them. Now, generally the small one is the best one to start with. I'm going to start with the bigger one today just because we have you know, limited screen size and it's just a little bit easier to work with, I think, to some extent. But usually small is easier because it's much easier to, like, when you kind of hack away at CSS, you'll find it's much easier to make the CSS expand out than it is to contract in. 100%. A lot of the time, you'll just kind of be naturally thinking flexibly as the page shrinks. But let's imagine for a second that I don't have the developer tools on this page and I can't right-click on things. We will inspect some things, but broadly, let's just pretend this is an image here. So now I know what kind of excitable response I'm going to get from all of you, but does anyone want to tell me how they'd start or where they'd start? If I said, I want you to clone, here's a picture of the Airtable website, I want you to make our own version of it that looks the same. Yeah, what's your name? Matthew. The doc type thing? It's a good question. Has anyone, just on that point, on Matthew's point, did anyone end up, I saw one student put some stuff in ChatGPT to play around with. Did anyone else try that? Yeah? All right, well, maybe we'll do that in the break. Be like, hi, ChatGPT, please generate me a Airtable website. Yeah, so, you know, we come here, we'd get our page. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a fairly simple page. I'll just call it our page.html, and we will open that up here in a new tab, hopefully. Yeah, so pretty empty page. Now, when I'm thinking about pages, the first thing I try and do, I try and think like, do things iteratively, right? So I want to get the macro elements together, and then I want to keep kind of refining them in. Don't get caught up in trying to make, you know, a header bar or a nav bar look perfect or anything like that. So I can see here we've got this white bar at the top. We've got title, nav, a couple of buttons, sign in, and then some big text here. So that's probably where I'm going to start. Now, yeah, we do have a lot of our boilerplate. I had someone in the forum ask today, they're like, what do we call our pages? I don't think we specified in the spec what title tag to use for any of assignment 1. The air conditioning turned off at 6 from the last lecture, so it's been heating up. It'll cool down. So you can call it like, you know, let's call it Airtable, or like, you know, isn't it like Donald Trump's Twitter handle? Sorry, the real Donald Trump, right? The real Airtable. Could be. I think that's like a 4 out of 10 funny. So we know that we've got some titles. Now I don't like to, when I'm starting off coding, do a lot of styles that aren't in line, because I just find them too hard to figure out. That class is here and that class is there. So I would generally just start off with a bunch of div styles, and you know, maybe this one is our header, and then under that we'll have the page. So what do we got in the header? Well, we know we've got like the Airtable logo. Then we know we've got product solutions, pricing, enterprise resources. So, you know, product solutions, pricing, enterprise, and resources. We know we've got 2 buttons, one that says, you know, contact sales, and the other one that says sign up for free. And we know we've got a sign-in link. Now, obviously, they're not going to look very good, but that's okay. That's an okay place to start. And then we've got some text here, and just for fun, let's actually copy that text because I'm not feeling it. And put that there. And let's just call this H1 because it's a giant piece of text. And then the small bit here looks like some kind of H4. It doesn't really matter. Like, is it H1 or H4? You know, because you as the web developer for the page dictate what H1 and H4 means, they're all kind of relative to each other. So like, if you're like, oh man, what should that be? You look at this and you think, well, there's 6 headings. Is this likely to be the biggest heading on the page anywhere in the site? Yes, probably. It's gigantic. So we make that H1. And then you think, all right, well, on the scale of 1 to 6, where 6 is the smallest heading, which is generally thicker than text, where do we think this thing lies, right? So I just said 4. Now you can go and change it later, right? It's pretty easy to replace all your text in a file. So we've got that. Oh, halfway there. Looks beautiful, doesn't it? And then we've got an image here. Now you can see it's a rotating image. There's lots of different ways to do this. Let's have a look at how they're doing it. I would not guess that it's a GIF, but let's see. What are they doing here? It's probably okay. This is all too small. Hello. Oh, it's a video. Oh, I love modern internet. It's very confusing. Okay, so it looks like they're actually playing a video here. That's incredible. I wouldn't have guessed that, to be perfectly honest. You can see the video's actually got color here, which is quite interesting because that means that, like, I'm pretty sure that would have color. So if you came along to, say, this web page and you were like, you know what, I don't really like that background, and you tried to change the background. Let me get rid of some of this stuff. It's very cramped here. Main, why can't we, how do we add? Why is that not
I don't
working?
get why this. What the heck?
I don't know. It's maybe background black. Yeah, so you can see there the video is actually, like, part of the border around the video is actually baked into the video itself, right? Now, that in itself is probably not good or bad. I imagine that most videos have to be rectangular in nature. I don't think that web technology or any just generally allows you to export a video that has like a border radius, like a box or something. So that was probably just by necessity, but this is really interesting. If you want to make something, and half this lecture is going to be random facts as well, because most of you can watch pre-recordings and Google things. If you want to make something animated like this, historically you'll use a GIF or a GIF, right? Who says GIF? Who says GIF? Interesting, right? You'll make I'll use them interchangeably so you don't know what I say. You'll make a GIF because the GIF will be able to, like, it can have animation. So historically you've got like JPEGs and PNGs and GIFs. And the GIF, I can't. I'm just gonna say GIF. It would actually have animations in it. That's why you see all those funny memes. But the problem with GIFs is that they basically don't have like a very big color space. They can only have so many colors. That's why most GIFs you see look kind of pixelated, you know? Like, you don't really see many high quality like GIFs of a monkey running into a wall. They're always like, they kind of look like they're from the 90s. But PNGs and JPEGs can generally go up to a much higher quality. So GIFs were kind of like the classic way of creating animation, and then later on people figured out how to use JavaScript that you'll learn about in week 3. Yeah, week 3. They'll use JavaScript to basically display a PNG, or a JPEG, which are higher quality, and then to essentially like swap it out and put a new one there and swap it out. So they kind of like create a slideshow with the JavaScript. And then obviously in the last 10 years, with some of the new HTML5 capabilities that exist, like video and audio, which we touched on a bit last week, people have just said, you know what, even easier than that, we can just make a video in some product and then just like we'll play that on repeat. So that's super interesting. And I think it's a really good example too of how a lot of stuff you see in web, there's not just like a clear-cut way of doing it. Because a lot of students will say like, how do I do this? And I'm like, well, there's lots of ways. Like videos are really interesting. I imagine the problem with video is probably that it's massive in terms of size. Because, you know, video is just a series of frames. And obviously videos have very smart compression algorithms. And I don't know how this video is compressed. Some video encoding will be very, very small because you can kind of bake into the video that it's actually just 4 frames, and here's where to swap between them. who knows, right? You could go like super deep on some of this stuff, but we've made that black
Oh, yeah.
now. That's not good. But let's put a custom image there anyway. Charak says
What's
rip.
up with subleft?
Cool. Let's not use one of these boring stock images. Oh, my friend up the front in the red shirt. Yes, you. Have I taught you before? Yeah. Okay, your face is super. What's your name? Anthony. Okay, okay. It's connecting some dots. Do you have a favorite or least favorite food? You love lasagna. Good. Well, let's go find some lasagna. Do you have a particular type of? I don't know if there's types of lasagna, but pick one of the 5 images. You'd eat this one? Who agrees? Who disagrees? Come on, come to life. Number 4? Okay, quick vote. Number 1? No hands. Number 2? Yeah, 2 or 3 hands. Number 3? Yeah, okay. It's like 40 odd hands. Number 4? Similar amount. Number 5? Okay. 1 and 2? That's not the way to go. I don't know, wavy pasta kind of scares me. I'm probably with the number 5 crew. You know, there's just something unnatural about that a little bit. But let's go with, that's a big image. It's also something to actually consider. You'll see this a lot on, so like let's say I'm going to save this down to my, where is it, Airtable. There we go, call it classic lasagna scale. Lasagna, let's go. .jpeg. So if you remember from the lecture we did on image stuff, JPEGs are really, really good at like giving you 90% of the quality for like 20% of the file size. So generally JPEGs are like the way to go for images that don't need to be perfect, which is why you'll see on most sites, JPEGs are generally great for like real world photos because the real world is naturally messy. If I took a photo of you right now, there's noise everywhere, right? Whereas if I have a beautiful graphic like, I don't know, say this Airtable logo or a logo of a company is a good example, right? Like Shopify, you don't really want noise or imperfections in that logo. It needs to be perfect. And it's also quite small. So generally real world stuff is like JPEG because you won't notice the difference if you make it a PNG. So let's go and put that image on our page. Image source is lasagna.jpg. Easy. Oh, okay. Now what do you notice here? This image is very big, right? Here's a common thing you'll see people do on websites. They'll be like, oh my god, that image is so big. I should make it like width is 500. Now generally don't do this with HTML attributes. You try and do all kind of sizing and placement with CSS. But you know, so that even though that still works, you're generally better off doing width 500 pixels because you get something like that. Now, that works, but you got to remember, you specifying the width, the browser still loads the image in its entirety and then it just scales it down. And that's something really important to consider. There was, I'm wearing the Sunswift shirt, right? The solar car thing on campus. Some of you might have seen it. And I remember it was like one of the years, it was like 3 years ago, they built a website and they put all of the team members' faces on the website, right? Like, you know, every society's got to like list out all 400 people that like don't even turn up kind of thing. It's like that, a site like that, and each image was like 4 megabytes in size because it was like a massive like raw camera photo. So you had like 60 images that were like 4 megabytes in size. So just like loading this web page would just like suck a quarter of a gig of data out of your phone, right? Like straight away, just because all these big images are there and just being scaled down. Now naturally, will you go to prison for that? Probably not. No one's going to like come and find you. What you will probably do though is when you have web pages that suck like that, Google generally ranks you down lower. So if you ever get to a point where you're trying to build web for something that's trying to end up on the front page of Google, if Google sees massive images like that, it's going to basically like derate your page way down. But that's just some random thing to think about. So we've got our lasagna. Actually, you might be asking, okay, well, what do I do if the image is big? Well, you can pick another image, or you simply have to resize it offline. Now you can do that a bunch of ways. You could either like, you know, dump it into a tool like Canva and resize it. You could, there's like free image resize editors online. Like, you know, like when who's ever been like PDF split or PDF combine? Just a quick Google to like solve a problem. There's stuff like that. Or you can use like more advanced tools like Photoshop, GIMP, or anything like that. There's a million things you could do. So we've got our page here now, and we're not getting very far because I keep talking about nothing. And now we'd like to try and maybe clean up how it looks a bit. Now, okay, so we see here that on the desktop view, we've got all this stuff at the top, and then we got this on the left and that on the right. How would people separate the left and the right content? Let's imagine you're in my shoes
Why
up
is
the
it
front
times
here.
here?
What would you do? What kind of general layout method would you use? Who said Flexbox? Oh, Anthony again? Okay. Why Flexbox? Flexible. Anthony likes flexibility, so Flexbox is good. Well,
So
you know,
height
if you
order does
were a dev, you'd kind of want to ask a question.
what
You know,
you
you want to
do.
learn more about the behavior here. So generally most things will come down to 90% of what you do is going to be flex, nearly always, and then 5% is going to be floats for some weird scenarios. In the case of a float here might be if that image was like a fixed size and it was just always tucked up in the corner and everything just kind of wrapped around it. Or you get into the whole position absolute stuff, but to be honest with you, most of the time position absolute comes into play for me is either a fixed size, like something floating over everything. Like for instance, that header bar is a great example of a fixed thing. Or the alternative, sorry, that's position fixed, but a position
What's going on with
absolute
subreddit?
is probably more when you have stuff at the bottom of an element. So I don't have any examples here, but a good example would be like, let's say I'm working on YouTube, and on YouTube, oh God. You know how you get all these see there's like little times here, that's like 30, 15 and all this kind of stuff. How to create ultimate Excel Gantt chart. See those like little 318, the timestamps. That's a really good example of like a position absolute, because you can just really quickly be like, yeah, bottom 5 pixels, right 5 pixels, just tuck it down there. You know, you're not thinking about flex layouts or anything like that. So, but in this case, flex is good. So how are we going to do flex? Well, we know that I like a good idea when you're coding is often to keep like wrapping everything in more divs. So in this particular case, this div here might be like the whole page layout. Whereas I want to have a div that is just, did I lose the page? Yeah. That is just like this top section with the blue background. So if I just want that top section with the blue background, I might create another div that has a display flex, like this. And then I'll close that div off. I'm going to change the tab size to something much smaller so we can see things. And then inside of that, let's see what this looks like. Now, you know, if you just make things display flex, they're going to kind of lump out like that. They're generally going to turn into that left to right order. Now, obviously, we want the lasagna to be on the right, but it's okay to have boxes within boxes. There's a really great tutorial exercise. It's one of the Flexbox questions. Let me just see what it is. Man, when people like snigger when there's like a long password, and like, you got a short password, guys. You should go and fix that.
What?
Where is it? It's someone might have done it. It's the nice one with the colored boxes, the colored flex boxes.
Why does
did
this
that
look so
last?
trash?
Does
Because
anyone know
it's
what
a
it's
div
called?
within a div.
My mouse keeps
Okay,
spacing.
that's why.
This is bad.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Okay.
None of you are
So
helpful.
this one.
Maybe it's next week's one. Replicate simple flex. I think it's a week 2 tutorial question, but I definitely recommend you go and do that question. I think it's a really good, really simple question that kind of covers what we're going to do here, which is that sometimes you want like 2 sides, but then within that things, like you don't just want things to be 1, 2, 3. You want like 2 columns, and then within one of those columns is like kind of rows. So now we have to say group that even further. And it's okay to just use divs like this. You know, divs are just block elements by default. So now we've got 2 divs. There you go. And now this will look slightly different because we've got that like left to right flex, of course, but we want to group the text vertically in one. So now we'll go and put a button. What's the button? What did it say on the website? It said sign up for free. Sign up for free. There's our button. Great. And then we can go and play around with these things more. For instance, like let's say we want them to be equally spaced, because that's what we talked about in the flex lecture. We got like, you know, flex 1, like this now.
Why is-
Obviously that's not working. Why is this not working? I set them both as flex 1. They should have the same ratio. Is it the semicolon? It's definitely not the semicolon. You know.
Why is right a bit high?
Didn't specify flex for the whole thing.
And yeah, that's about the same.
Yeah. Yeah, so just to recap for those who couldn't hear, it's like, maybe we should try and get the flex ratios right in terms of like here, if we want the picture to be bigger, then the flex ratio should be bigger. Now, we're kind of getting that effect right now by accident, but for the wrong reason, which I'm just guessing what it is. I think it's the width, right? It's the width of the image. Because what flex will try and do is flex will just like have an equal ratio there, but if you say the image is 500 pixels, it's just going to shove it bigger if it can, right? So that's why, like, when we have this as 500 pixels, sure, it's like, yeah, okay, I can be even. You'll see if we zoom out, though, it'll even out. See that? Because it's like trying to get the ratio. But as it gets bigger, it's like, this image is really fat. I'm just going to have to, like, shove it into your corner. And then you might be thinking, well, what happens if we have 2 images? That's a good question. We get that. And this is, like, these kinds of layout quirks are probably the hardest thing to get used to with CSS. Because... playing around. Because what happens here is that, you know, by default, when you say something is like a 100% width, it will go and just fill out the web browser size, no matter how big you make it. But in this case here, the components inside of it are 500 pixels. We've specified that they're 500 pixels. So what happens is that they like, I have to be this size. And then that makes the outer components bigger, which makes this entire page bigger than the window itself. See how we've got this like horizontal scrolling effect now? That's generally something you want to avoid when you build web pages, right? Horizontal scrolling is like no one really uses websites in 2 dimensions, right? It's just like up and down. Sure, you might have like your Netflix like horizontal scroll kind of thing, but that's like basically moving icons across. You don't really have that. So let's get rid of the 500 pixel requirement. A really common thing sometimes might be like a min width. A min width is pretty common. So maybe you want the image to be, you know, like at least 100 pixels. Oh, okay. Or like a max width of like, this is the problem with like these things.
That's
so,
a bit iffy.
yeah, now that's as small as the browser will go. Generally it's why it's good to have down. Why is that page so fat? Does anyone know? It's quite interesting. Yeah, so one thing we've seen on the forum, and I used to have this in a FAQ somewhere, but I must have gotten rid of it because we see the question come up a bit, is like, I don't remember the exact, what is it, viewport, what do I Google? Viewport scale. There's some, what do people Google to get it? I never remember it. Does anyone remember? Meta tag, thank you, that's fair. There's like a viewport meta tag that looks like a generalized. Yeah, that's okay. This tag, if you put it at the top of the page, not at the top of the page, just in the head. A typical mobile optimized site contains something like this. Not all devices the same width. You should make sure that your pages. Now, I won't lie to you. I don't have. Someone here will be able to explain this better than me. But it's basically some magic mumbo jumbo that makes sure that your web page understands mobile device. Anyone's ever tried to use dev tools to like code stuff? Sometimes you'll notice that weird thing where you're like, you're kind of zoomed out, but you're not kind of zoomed out, or like the width doesn't make sense. If you add this to your meta, then you get these like nice pages that start to make sense now. And you can see here that now it's just shrinking in as we'd expect. You know, as the page gets bigger, that gets bigger. And yeah, you can see the image has a min width. That's why a max width. That's why it stays like that. But then as we get smaller here,
I can just.
I wonder why that is. That's interesting. Probably because we can only get so small without dev tools. Maybe. Yeah, there you go. Though this is really interesting too, because when you like build pages, you'll notice that pages will go through. See this, how the content's staying the same size here? But then you will reach a point. sometimes you got to be careful because that's not actually now. See how that's like changing the page width. But when we get to this point here, now it's actually just shrinking the whole page down. What that's saying is like if you loaded this page up on your mobile, what it would do is it would kind of like zoom out a little bit to make everything fit. So, you know, some pages, if you have like a page that's effectively 600 pixels wide, but your phone can only do 400, it'll just like scale it out a little bit. Now, the reason for this, does anyone know why? Why is that text not just, why is that text not getting smaller? It got smaller well, it didn't get smaller, but why is it not just all compressing down more? What text? Any text. Like, why does it get to this point and then stop? There. Yeah, exactly. What's your name? Catherine. So Catherine just made a good point. You don't want a letter on each line. And that's the default behavior of how text will work on a web page, is that it is really happy to wrap text by default. Obviously, if you watch like the achieve anything there, it's happy to move it down to the next line. But when you get to this point, it's like, I'm not just going to cut that word in half. I'm just going to like leave it there. And that essentially means now, what have we got? We've got an image with a minimum width of 100 pixels. And now we've got some text with a fixed size, because H1 has a size. We didn't define it, but it's got a default size. So these two things, like immovable sizes, are just like up against each other. So when we go any further down, it's just like, man, I just got to zoom out at this point. You know? So how do you get around that? Well, you know, if you put the minimum width smaller on the image, that's probably going to help, I imagine. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure why that doesn't. I haven't really thought about it, but like, let's say we reduce the size of this to say, you know, font size 1em, which is the, I think in the lecture we talked about rem, which is the standard size. This should work now. Okay, that image is still pretty big. I don't know why the max width is. I think for this it's because, you know, images, like, you might think it's intuitive, and I thought it was intuitive writing this up, right? But the image is massive, you know, by nature. So it's trying to always be its real size. Its real size is gigantic. So when we say a minimum width of 50, it's like, okay, I don't care. Like, I'm massive. When we say a max width, it's like, okay, that's as big as I can get. So I'm imagining here that even though, like, and this is where you just got to start getting used to the behavior of web pages, that image just thinks, okay, sure, my minimum's 50, but I'm gigantic. Why would I be smaller? You know? Like, if you think about it deeply enough, there's no reason it should just somehow know it needs to go.
I don't know why I cut this.
If you say, but then it gets kind of tricky, because, like, if you add another element to it, let's try this out. Oh. Now some weird things are happening. And this is because, you know, the image has a width. Its inherent width, which is probably like 2,000 pixels or something. When we say width 100%, we're now telling it we want you to be the actual width of the container that you're within. You know, so it's within this kind of flex element, and this flex element will kind of shrink and grow. So let's make, you know, the flex element's background red, for instance, so we can kind of see the difference here. We've got a blue background, red background.
Right.
Okay. Now you see that something's still, still too big apparently. Oh, my mouse is gone again. There we go. So you can see those flexes make sense. They're getting the same size, and then the image just gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And then it gets down to this point. How big is it here? Well, it's 50 pixels. Okay, so we've got a minimum, we've got a maximum. This is a pretty common pattern you see with images, where, like, particularly big images, if you want it to just be like content, like scale aware, where it just always fills the container, you have to make its width 100%, because it will always try and fill the container, unless obviously it has an upper bound or it has a lower bound. An image's default max width will be, well, if you say it's 100%, it's going to fill the container no matter how big the page is. Because it's like literally, it's like I will follow your command. It's 100%. So that's why, you know, max min width. Okay, we've really talked about that for a while. Are people finding this useful? Yeah.
Overflow hidden.
Okay, maybe. We'll find out. Nearly there. We're not going to finish this, but that's okay. So great, we've got the core elements there. Let's now play around with maybe some of the styling. So I've got to make this header H1 again. Oops. I was not paying attention to what I was doing there. Okay, connect everything, achieve anything. That's very dramatic. We got the lasagna there. Okay, now the logo. Let's see how Airtable does their logo. So Airtable's logo, I was quickly looking at this on my laptop on the way in, and I was like, you know what? Like when you see logos, there's usually one or two things you'll see. One is it'll be an SVG, which is a vector graphic, or it'll be a PNG, which is just a high quality raster image, they call it. Who's seen the images lecture pre-record? Most of you? Okay, cool, you get that part. If you haven't, go watch that lecture. I can't remember if it's...
I'm trying to
I think it's
hidden.
recommended. But usually, it's basically every image is either like .png, .jpeg, or it's like a whole bunch of runaway, you know, like scary looking stuff. So that little Airtable icon is, let me just copy and paste it. Copy outer HTML, I think that's what I want. That's the Airtable icon, right? Now, what that means is that it's not an actual image with pixels, it's a series of instructions for the browser to paint an image. Generally, SVGs are common with things that are, you know, like colorful drawings, right? You imagine someone who's like really, really good at some drawing tool that all they've got is like gradients and colors and lines and circles and squares, and you can make a million things out of those basic elements. That's what this is. And these are really cool because, I mean, if we decode it, obviously we have, you have like your SVG outer layer, which just kind of specifies the SVG. And again, this is all kind of covered in the SVG lecture itself. So we have a lecture on images where we talk about the different types, and then there's like an extended one on SVGs where they kind of explain how they work. But basically, it is a grouping. There's like a little container, and then inside of that, there's a bunch of things that it draws. And if you actually pay attention and you were to spend the time to decode it, you would see that what we've got here is we've got 4 different paths. And those paths, I could not tell you because I'm not a genius what they are, but I imagine that they are probably, let's make this really big. They are probably the yellow square, the blue square, the red, yellow shape, the blue shape, the red shape, and that darker red shape. That's the logo, right? It's just like 4 solid colored shapes which have like a different polygon look. And that's all represented here. So I could go and take that, for instance, and I could go and dump that on my page up the top. So instead of saying Airtable logo, we know it says Airtable the text.
It's
so here we will just like put it here. Now, that's really ugly, right?
I don't care.
Kind of scary looking.
See how they do it.
But that'll do. Oh, okay. Well, let's have a look at it. Width 100%, height 100%. Golly. Okay, what do we do? I don't know. Maybe we'll contain it within a div. Divs are like just everything
Actually,
you're doing is just like div,
it.
div, div. Oops. Div, div, div all the time, every day. That's all you need to think about. Divs are all you need. Let's say width 100 pixels. Let's contain it, right? So that SVG wants to be as big as it can, but if we bound the container that's inside of it, then it's only that big. Except now it looks really weird up there. If we give it a height bounding of say 50 pixels. Okay, so what happened there was that it was trying to fill out 100% width, 100% height, but we told it, no, we want you to be like 100 pixels wide, the container 100 pixels wide. But the SVG itself was still trying to get 100% height. It's really hard to tell what's what because as you might have seen with images, if you scale an image down, its height follows, right? But that didn't happen there. Again, those are just those things you kind of get comfortable with. So you think, okay, there's our nice little image. But what we haven't done here also is we haven't made our little header bar, which I think was just white. Yeah, it was just white. And then the rest of the page was blue. So maybe let's quickly go do that. So we know that we've got our header up here, which let's say has background white. Generally don't use text colors. I do that in a lot of the lectures because it's like kind of an introductory concept to you. But I'd probably encourage that you use a lot of like hex. I like hex codes. I like RGB too. I find RGBs are really useful when I like vaguely know what I want. So for instance, if I'm like, you know what, red, green, blue. I want something that's like really red, like 255, the max.
1, 2, 3,
like 2 to the power.
4,
What's 2 to the power? Is
5,
it 8 or 8? Sorry?
1, 2, 3.
What's like 2 to the power of what is 255?
There's like 12 blocks in here.
No, I don't know. Is it 8? 16? 12? Who cares? I like that attitude. Who cares, right? You can Google it. I find RGBs really useful when like 255 is the max, 0 is the minimum, and I'm like, I want something that's super red and like kind of green and kind of blue. Now you might be thinking, how does he know what that'll look like? And I don't know what that'll look like. That just sounds like a smart idea. And then you do it and you're like, oh God, that wasn't right. So that can be a fun way to play around with colors. Obviously in reality, you're gonna go to a color picker. All you have to do is like just Google color picker and you'll find a website or something built into like, oh, there's a, I don't know, you just try things out. I haven't found the site before, but there's a million ways you can do it. Obviously, we've got one in the assignment, like there's extensions you can use. But the other way to do it is just hex codes. Now, I find hex codes really useful for grays because with grays, you can do a shorthand, which is just like 3 hex characters, and that just like pulls it out to the full amount. So if you just do like #FFF, that equates to the full 6. And the reason I find this useful is because you think a hex, F's the highest number, single highest hex digit, 0 is the lowest. So you got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. F's white, 0 is black, everything in between is a shade of gray. So it's really simple for me. So if I'm like, for instance, if I want black, it's just 0. If I want something that's like white, it's F. And then if I'm like, I want something that's like kind of in between, maybe I'll do like 9. That gets me that like dark gray. And if I'm like, I want something that's white, but like just a tiny bit gray, then we can just go like E. So that's a really fast way if you want to kind of get like 16 shades of gray in your head really quickly. Pretty useful, I find. But in this case, it's a background of white. And then we know here that the other area has a background of what? It's like a light blue. Oh, you know what that's great for? RGB. So if I want like a light blue, what that probably means is that I'm going to have really bright red, really bright green, and absolutely super bright blue. Right? That's kind of the intuitive way of thinking about RGB, and I'll probably get something that looks close-ish. Not really. That's because I don't understand color theory. But you can see the gist. You obviously wouldn't do that. You'd normally go find a color picker. But let's just stick with that color. You'll also notice that the web page itself has this annoying little border around the outside if you look closely. See that stupid border on the left there? Most pages you get around that just by adding, again, you would normally add this to a style block. That's just where you add a 0 margin to that property, and then everything kind of like moves out like that. Back to the header. Actually, let's add a nice font to it too. Arial's a much more modern font. Okay, so we're slowly getting there. Any YouTube questions so far? Monica says 4. What's that for? Oh, the lasagna. Okay, that's good. Not Monica, Monka. Okay, sorry, Monka. Monka's at home being like they don't care about my opinion. We care, just not immediately, because we're bad. So let's say we got this page, great. Text sizes, let's try and get this header bar wrapped up, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll go for a bit longer after the break. So, okay, some buttons. Text or buttons? No one cares, but like, let me ask you anyway. Do you want to do the text or the buttons first? Buttons, okay. I love the people in the crowd that are like, man, no one cares, I don't care, but if I don't say something, we're going to go through that 10 seconds of him being like, someone give me an answer. So buttons, we've got a white button and we've got a blue button. Now you can see that they have hover attributes as well, so that's something to keep in mind. Hovers are really hard to do with inline styles. They're generally where you need to break something up into explicit CSS, like explicit style blocks. And also, these buttons have a lot of common properties, so it's probably the first time in our like page hacking that we actually have to reuse something. They're both going to have the same border radius, the same size. So it's a good time to now stop using inline styles and actually come down and say, you know what, we'll give these buttons a class of header button, something like that. Just a random silly name. So I'll go make myself a style block up the top. I won't lie to you. I don't know if there's ever a downside of not including the type equals text CSS. I've included it, I've not included it. I've never seen anything break from it. If anyone ever finds out what it does negatively, please let me know, because I'm still searching. So we have a header button. Well, what's that header button going to do?
Invalid.
Let's give it some basic styles. Like we'll have a white background. We'll have a border radius of, say, 5 pixels. I don't know how big that is. Just pick a number. Just always pick a number and see how it looks. It also looks like it has some nice padding around the text. It's a little less tight than a normal button. So maybe that has a 5 pixel padding. And let's see how this looks comparatively. Okay. Looks okay. What's some weirdness about it? If I just go between them. It's not terrible. What doesn't feel right about it to people? Oops. The space. What do you mean? The spacing between the buttons? Yeah. So definitely the spacing between the buttons is wrong. That's something that we could probably try and fix. You could do this a whole bunch of ways. You know, if you're more in control of the layout, like flex would be a way to create gaps. But like, let's check. Is it as the page gets bigger and smaller? Does that gap stay the same? Okay, you can see there the gap stays the same. That's probably by design. So that sometimes if you have pages where the whole page just like awkwardly expands out like the ever-expanding universe, it just looks like really unnatural. So they're going to be quite fixed together here. What that would tell me usually is that they probably have some kind of side margin. So maybe like a margin where there's like 5 pixels on each side. Something like that. You know, they just got a bit of that side spacing. You notice the border's also a little bit, Catherine, right? Yeah.
It's like 1 FR12 or something. Oh, frick, what is it?
For, in general? Like for, what do you mean?
I remember something
like for this scenario or just in general?
This is funny as. Let's see how I did it.
Probably like for the lasagna. Yeah, like so a span I generally find is only ever really used for text.
Repeat auto fit.
And even then sometimes like inline blocks work really well.
Weird.
Spans are really good if you want to say group text by like this text has that color, this text has that color. They have different sizes or something like that. So I'd say it's the natural way to help group the properties of text. Is the simplest answer. But we might see that a little bit as we play around with the nav bar here. But again, we'll be quick so we can have a quick break. Buttons have a default style on the borders where there's kind of like a thicker border on the bottom. That's to give the impression of it being a little bit like out of the web page. I remember reading this thing, it was really interesting because again, like I've been doing this web design stuff for so long, and if you go look at like all the original pages that I was coding up a long time ago, everything was like 3D. Everything had shadows, right? It was like shadows and borders and circles and everything was like really thick borders, and when you clicked on it, it felt like you were like punching through the page and back, you know? And then there was the big modernization we saw probably in like the 2010s somewhere, and you probably all remember it, you're not that young. It's like where suddenly everything started to feel flat again. Do you remember that? It was like Microsoft did it, Google did it, things that kind of felt chunky. Like most buttons now didn't have this like border. Like see, this feels retro to me a little bit now, right? And I was really interested in that because I was like, that's really strange because the early web was really flat and then it got really 3D-ish and then it went really flat again. And the best things I could find about it were that when you look at the original kind of design principles in the early 2000s, they were trying to teach people how to use the internet who hadn't used it before. So you needed to put borders and shadows and buttons on things so people could understand how layers work, so you could understand that this is something you can click on. It's actually like, you know, imagine you give it to a kid, there's like a couple of things that come out of the page they might want to bash with their hand, right? So, but then like as people basically became totally acclimatized to technology, we don't need it anymore, and we opt for the much cleaner look. So that's why you'll see most web pages now kind of, this would be considered like a very dated look for a button, whereas if we say it had a really flat border, let's just go with, I really like #333 is really good. It's like off black. It's not quite as punchy as black, which I know might like not seem like a difference, and maybe it's hard to tell on the projector, but sometimes like full black can feel like quite dark. That's really not the best example of it. I think text is a better example of it. See how that text, particularly the bold text, is really strong? Sometimes if you actually just sometimes if you say just change the color of all your text to be like a really off black, the page feels like a little bit lighter. It's just really really unrelated. Probably don't do that. I'm sure if you asked anyone in the real world, they'd be like, who the hell told you to do that? So we got those buttons there. They look mostly okay. I do notice that there's a little bit more space on the sides of the text within the buttons, and that usually implies to me that we have somewhat inconsistent padding. So that the top padding might be 5 pixels, but that the side paddings might be 10 pixels. Something more like that. And then lastly, you can see that, last couple of things, you can see that one of the buttons is blue. I don't know what color of blue that is. Let's cheat and let's have a look. That is this color. So we're going to go steal that color. So one of the buttons is blue, one of the buttons is not blue. We could now say that, you know, blue, let's just do this. Blue has a background of that. Again, you can say background color. That's more specific. That's probably technically more of the correct thing to do. Or we can just say background, which will figure out that we're using that compound property, and it'll make sense of what we're doing there. And then I can go and give one of the buttons a blue look, for instance. So now we've got our, oh, that doesn't look quite right, does it? And that's because the blue button, if you notice on the Airtable page, actually has white text. So we need to give the color white here. And now it's starting to look more right. You see that the border suddenly looks a bit weird now. You can see that the blue button actually looks like it has no border, and the other button has a much softer border. So, okay, there's like a grayer border there, and here we might say border none, like this. So, obviously that's not quite right. You got to be, like, I won't go much deeper in this, but you can see here that these buttons are the same size. So if you were to draw a ruler across the bottom of it, it would be perfectly aligned. But here, can you tell the left button's thicker because that border makes it like a pixel thicker? It's just like slightly off-putting, isn't it? So I don't remember the property, but there's like a CSS property that's like CSS border inside. Someone might know it off the top of their head, but like you can move it to the inside. My mouse is frozen again. Maybe not. I don't know what box sizing is. I'm not familiar with that element. But you can play around with that. You don't need to watch me Google everything today. It's frozen. And the hover, which was the last thing. You notice when we put our mouse over it, things go slightly darker. Well, that's pretty easy. We come here and we say, you know what? For the header button, when someone hovers over it, we're going to have the background be like maybe, again, like a really slight gray. And for the blue, when someone hovers over it, we need to have a slightly darker background color. And you know, this is usually where you go and punch the hex code. Like if I'm pretty sure you can just Google this. Like you just Google that hex code, and then Google has an editor. So I can just be like, oh, I want that to be darker. Really quick, these things down here are called color spaces. You got RGB, CMYK, HSV, and HSL. Again, one of the two of you here are going to be an expert in this, but RGB is red, green, blue. HSV is hue, saturation, and value, which is that brightness? Something. Hue is color, which is a bit of a weird concept. If you think of color as like a big 360-degree spectrum, it's like every color that exists. Saturation is how bright it is. So if you want something to be darker and you're not sure how to tweak the red, green, blue values, well, obviously you could come up here and you could just like literally drag this downwards, or you could come here and make it a little less saturated with like 80.
3 columns, 4 rows.
See, I don't even know what I'm talking about. Don't know why that's so. Oh yeah, of course, because saturation is how like strong the color is, right? Which makes sense. That's why if you do like 1% saturation, it's basically white.
Oh, that's in.
It's like pastel. But let's play with this value. What happens if we bring this down? That's more of what I meant there, right? That's like the brightness. Normally I'm used to, I don't know what I used to call it, but I'm used to that kind of describing that one as the brightness. So now we like reduce the brightness so we can go and copy the hex code, and we go back to the page and we come here, and when we, there we go, that's better. And then the last thing, most things with hovers, you will, let's combine them. Let's say header button and dot blue. When these both have hover, we want to change the cursor. That's a really, really common thing to do because this looks really unnatural. Our brains are hardwired to think that this little thing here means we can't click it, right? That little like pointer cursor, I can't remember what it's called. But if you do the pointer cursor, that's where you now, when you put your mouse over, you get that little hand that comes up to click something. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break, and then let's do a bit more for like 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll wrap up.
This isn't gonna span. Bottom left is gonna span 1 more, 2 columns. Oh wait, 2 rows, 2 columns. Yeah, seems about right. Two rows. Background color, whatever that is. Red's like a pale red. Bottom left is like a pale yellow. Good enough. Bottom right's like a greenish. Nice. Oh no. Column gap. We need row gaps as well. Wow, that is so much easier. That's close enough. Yeah, that's as close as you're getting. Whatever. Nice. Okay, okay, commit dash. What is this called? CS replace simple size. Simple flux. Get pushed. Nice. Okay, what's the next question? Oh, what? There's still more to go.
No, I'm getting some very upsetting head shakes. I ordered a bank card that arrived on time today.
Simple flux.
Yay.
Okay, we're done with 2. That's great.
That's good. I just started the recording mid-clap, so it's going to look like an amazing introduction.
Whatever.
All right. All right.
Actually, no, let's play puzzles.
Okay, so
Oh,
you know, the
Already
point of
started.
these
I'm gonna
demos is
lose.
not to make everything perfect, because as you probably experienced from assignment 1, making things perfect is sometimes a lot of doing the same thing over and over and iterating further. So I'm trying to cover these key things like buttons, repeated classes, SVGs, flex, the images. Obviously, we can go change this sign up for free button now to a button class. That's the benefit of us. Oh, sorry, I have it on. Yep, thank you. Bam. I have it on, yep. So there's the button there, which is good. Couple things. I want to look at the mobile sizing. That's definitely one of them. I want to maybe take a quick look at the animation, and I want to look at the fixed position, which was also kind of covered in one of the pre-records. A really common question people have is like, oh, what if I want this to be like 100% of the height? Because obviously this page is really long, but what happens if I want this div with the blue background to be the full height? Well, you could try and say height's 100%, and that kind of works, but height 100% on a div is really, really tricky. Because what it does is that it says, okay, well, you know, with width it's really easy because your browser has a side. With height it's a bit trickier because what's the height of the page? Well, I don't know. Is the height of the page just the content? Is it the window? Like, is it longer than that? And you can see what actually happens here is that when I did height 100%, it actually it took the height of the window, which is the closest thing it knows to 100%, and it said that's my height. So let's say that the window is 1,000 pixels high. Our blue background component is now 1,000 pixels high, which is confusing because the header is like 100 pixels high. So now the page is like 1,100 pixels. That's why we get this awkward scroll thing, because that blue box is the height of the window, but that white thing on the top is problematic. Now, again, a few different ways you can solve this. In this particular page, one way you could do it is to say, you know what, let's actually create, you know, say some, let's imagine you want the whole page to be blue. Well, you might come across and actually just make the whole, you know, the whole website blue. That's one way to do it. Right. Now that works if everything's going to be the same color, and then you can have boxes inside of that that are different colors. Let's try that one out. Now this is assuming that we want everything to be that particular shade of blue.
There's a rook.
Obviously we've got some redundant properties here. Notice, pay real close attention. Mouse is frozen. I don't know why it does that. Does anyone else ever have that? I only ever have that when I connect the projector sometimes. Stupid expensive MacBooks.
I lost 2 rooks. Whoops. Anyways.
Who's a Linux user at home? You're all like a lot less nerdy than I'm used to. Say, normally like 3 or 4. Who's like a Linux user at home but doesn't want to tell anyone tonight?
I have people talking about Linux.
Miguel?
users.
Okay. Who uses Windows at home? WSL, I'll count as Windows. Who uses Windows at home? Who uses like OS X, Mac at home? Okay, pretty even split. That's quite interesting. Oh, my mouse. God damn it. So the problem with this is that you'll see when I scroll now, if it lets me scroll, that because, you know, web browsers, they render a page, and when I try and pull the page further down and I hit the top, it really doesn't like me scrolling. See that little blue bit that appears at the top? Did you catch it the first 2 times before it broke? That's the body background, right? So that's one downside of doing this method, is when you try and scroll up above the page, it'll just show whatever the natural background is. But let's imagine this page is super long. I'm going to go and add a few extra components here, just to beef out the page. So we'll create a few letters of the alphabet here, A, B, C, D. So now the page is really long, right? What do we notice about the Airtable page is that the header is fixed. Again, pretty simple. So let's fix the header. Fixing headers is really, really, really easy. All you have to do is be like, well, there's our header, and you just say position fixed, and by default, position fixed will put it at the very top of the page. Now, oh no, we've got a problem here now, which is that, so what's position fixed done? A couple of things. One is that it's now floating above everything, which isn't good. That's what we wanted it to do, but we didn't quite want it to do that. And then the second thing is that it kind of shrunk in a bit because it's just trying to be as wide as it needs to be. So, a couple things we could do here. One thing I'd probably recommend doing in this case is just, you know, you just focus on this element being 100% width and giving it an explicit height, like that. That works pretty well. The good thing about fixed elements is they're generally the same height and the same width. They're really easy to hard code in pixels. And if, you know, if it's not pixels, it's just like a percentage. That height might be a bit big, so if we make it 80 pixels, now we have something like that. Now, obviously, what's inside of that isn't quite right at the moment, but that's okay. But now we've got this, our main element here doesn't work well. A couple ways you can solve that one. One of the ways you could solve it is you could go and make yourself a empty pointless div. It's like a mystery div. It's 80 pixels high and no one cares about it. So now there's kind of like an empty div that's 80 pixels high, like literally sitting right under it, like a wasted space. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it is to not do that and to simply give your main, like if you have like one div that covers the whole web page, just give it a top margin.
What should I do?
Martin. Give it a top margin of 80 pixels. And that'll do the exact, no, it won't. I always think it'll do the exact same thing. Padding. I remember that. That kind of works too. Play around with that. The margin one's super weird. I remember that. That was kind of odd, right?
Whatever.
It's like, oh, why is it doing that? I don't have an answer for you. I understand what it's doing. It's putting a margin above the image, but for some reason the position fixed element is like sitting below it. Does anyone know why? I'm asking. I don't know. I assume it has something to do with, I don't know. Like there's always going to be some technical thing like, do you remember when we did the layout lectures, how we talk about, you know, position absolute is relative to the nearest non-static container. It's going to be something random like that. You know, I do these things where I just shrug my shoulders at you sometimes. It's not to kind of laugh about what I don't know. It's really just to demonstrate that like that's normal. You know?
That's a pretty funny.
Like you don't finish this course or work on this stuff for 3 years and then be like, aha, that exact thing I know right now, because I don't know everything off the top of my head.
Bang.
Some things I might have to go and play around with for a while or ask someone. That's okay.
Nope. Bang.
Can you immediately, just after a week of doing this stuff, feel how broad web dev is? Right, it's like the total opposite of maybe learning a really simple scripting language or a language like C, where there's just like 8 things you have to learn and you go program for a while and solve hard problems. There's just like bottomless pits of things. Okay, so last couple of things then. Mobile resizing and the animation. So the animation one is kind of fun, and it's what we see on the Airtable page where that appears and disappears. Now, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the size of a lot of this text so that things are a little bit more. So 0.7 REM is the relative text size, and I want that SVG to not be so like fat like this. I don't know why it's so taking up the whole space there. We can go figure it out. It's because I put it in a div, right? And divs are block elements. Block elements fill the entire line. They create a new line, and then when they're done, they create a new line. So it's like, okay, well, what can I do there? Well, you know, Catherine asked before about spans. Well, what happens if we try and make this particular SVG that we wrapped in a div? What happens if we make it a span? I don't know why that is. That's weird. Spans. So the problem with spans are that, like, we talk about spans are for text. They literally are for text, because I'm pretty sure you can't really have, at least not easily, not that I can think of, you can't really give a span a width and a height very easily. They're kind of just designed to wrap content. They're these truly styleless HTML tags. But then you think, okay, the problem with a block element is it takes up a whole new line. And this is one of those scenarios where I'm just guessing, because I'm figuring this out with you as I go. This is where inline block is really useful, because what inline block is inline block gives you all of the elements of a block component, except it doesn't create a new line before and after. So it lets you do things like margins and widths and heights as you'd intuitively expect, but it doesn't kind of create a whole new line here. Now, obviously now, this component's super massive, which is kind of annoying. So, you know, now we need it to be like 30 pixels or something and maybe like a height of not 700. You know, there's a much more contained header bar, but we still notice that our text is in a weird spot. So, well, how will we get around that?
What do I do here?
Zoom out just a tiny bit. Well, sometimes you might go and play with margins again. So just coming back up here, let's say that we know our SVG is going to be that particular height. What happens, again, just play around with it. What happens if we give it a top padding? Okay, it kind of sits
There's
down.
so many things I can do.
Now all of our
What's the
text
best
just
one?
went down, which is kind of weird. Generally, it's not good to, generally if you have divs, try and wrap everything in a div. It will help kind of solve some problems for you. This will create a bit of a weird thing where it's on a new line again, because every div has to be on its own new line. So let's try and do ourselves a display inline block again.
Bruh.
Sometimes you get to a point like this where you realize that you should probably just use flex for this maybe.
Oh.
You know, like it's basically like two
I was
elements.
wrong.
I mean, we kind of
that?
saw that on the
True.
Airtable page, right? It's got like these fixed
Anyway,
elements on the
It's a
side
battle.
and then fixed elements on the other
balance.
side. It's probably a really good use case for flex. It's probably
I
what
was
I
wrong.
imagine this is
That's
done in.
crazy.
I'm not going to have a look this time around. But you see our second bunch of text here, maybe we want to give that, say, a bottom margin of 10 pixels. So all of those elements there. When margin doesn't work and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing, you can always try padding. When that doesn't work, you're like, man, I don't really know what's happening here. This is a good time to inspect your elements. When you inspect your elements, you will start to understand what is going on. You can see there that the div is just sitting there. Ah, okay, so not 100% sure why that's happening, but it seems, does anyone know? That's actually quite odd to me, even. Not too sure. Sometimes it's a good time to give up and use flex. Right, so maybe we should try again. Maybe we should just quickly go and regroup,
What's this?
try and use flex. We'll come back here and say, well, that first, let's make the container display
What's
flex
that?
first,
Okay.
right? Will that work with the fixed? I'm not sure. We'll have to be careful there. Let's try our flex ones. You don't need flex one, but it's okay, right? The ratios are all out, but the gist of it's okay. Let's not give it a flex one and let's instead give it a width. Now remember with flex will just try and figure it out. So if I say one of these things is flex one and the other is width 70 pixels, flex will be like, I'm going to put the 70 pixel width there and then the other thing is just going to fill that space. So that's really useful for us because then the other element, we can probably now more meaningfully give a little margin on the top to buffer it down. Okay, so again, we're just tweaking it. We're trying a different approach. This seems to be on track, right? I'm probably going to park this here for that particular example, but I want to play with the animation because if you search CSS animation, because I don't do animations enough that I never remember how to do this on the top of my top of my head. It's frozen again. It always seems to freeze when I scroll. Just the mouse doesn't move. Oh yeah, it really, really doesn't like scrolling.
Oh, no, that's wrong.
So you'll see lots of stuff about CSS animations, and I'm going to stop scrolling on that page.
It's not good. It's not good.
But generally, let's say we take our Airtable text up here. That's looking kind of, isn't that funny? That header bar doesn't look too bad now, does it? You know, making progress on what we want. Let's say we take our Airtable text, and I'm going to wrap this in a span.
Oh, GG's.